welcome to members of the public who are joining via a live stream on YouTube. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this meeting in public that we're having today. In terms of the meeting, we've clearly this is on Teams, and I've asked our members of the governing body to keep their cameras on through the business of today, and I've asked them not to particularly use the chat function, but for us to have the conversation with you listening in. We're intending to take a break after item 9 for 5 minutes, so there will be a board go up to say we're on a break while we go and do what's necessary, and we look forward to welcoming any questions that you have. Simon Morgan will be collating those questions, and we've also had questions come in from members of the public in anticipation of the meeting occurring today. In terms of apologies for absence, we've had apologies from Stephen Chicken, Aisha Tizara and Badri from Public Health, and Maddie Baker-Woods, our Chief Operating Officer, is currently on an NHS England call around the flu programme and will be joining us later in the meeting. So as the wave 2 of COVID draws ever nearer, I think it is really important for us to reiterate the advice of our Chief Medical Officer in terms of trying to help keep ourselves safe and keep each other safe, and just to remind everyone of the importance of social distancing, of hand washing and using appropriate face coverings. And of course, further advice will come from our Prime Minister later today, and the Chief Medical Officer and our politicians as time progresses and the impact of COVID becomes clearer. So the other important reminder to everyone is that the NHS is open. It's remained open. It just is different. And for general practice particularly, our colleagues have been working hard to keep you safe, to keep our staff safe, and to keep the premises safe so that we can continue to provide you with a service as much as we possibly can. So it's different, but please get in touch when you need us. Get in touch with us in the way that you've become used to, whether that's by telephone or by email. Please do use the channels in order to get a response from us, because we are there for you. So please do come to us when you need us. Going to move on to the body of the meeting. Going to start with declarations of interest, of any hospitality or gifts. We have got a list of interests that is within the public sphere, and it's here in the papers. I was just going to ask Imran if he wanted to update any declarations of interest specifically for himself, as it's been a little while since we've got something down. Imran, did you have anything specific to update in your declaration?
Yeah, apologies, Mark. We are no longer members of Suffolk Primary Care as a practice, and I'll amend that with immediate effect, Mark.
Okay, thank you. And did anyone have anything to declare over and above for any of the items on today's agenda? Can't see anyone with their hand up, in which case we'll move on to the minutes of the previous meeting of the CCG governing body. Did anyone have anything that they found was incorrect, that they wish to see amended? Are we happy to see these as a correct record of our meeting? Anyone with a hand up anywhere? No. So Joe, that's fine. if we can then move on to the matters arising and the action log. So we have the first item is on today's agenda, the Emergency Food Fund. The second item, 047, I was just wondering whether we had any feedback to give around how the way the governing body has gone virtual, how that has been received, and whether there's any feedback from our public around how we can improve things. Amanda or Simon, have you got any further update?
I have no further update, Chair. As far as I'm aware, we've had no feedback from the public, but Simon, do you have any additional information to share, please?
Well, this is our first time that we've actually live streamed this governing body meeting, but I think we'd very much encourage anybody with any feedback to get in touch with us, and we'll report it in time for the next meeting. Okay,
thank you. So we'll keep that on for the moment, if that's okay. So 069, Sizewell C, have we got any update?
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the task that we spoke about at the last governing body, short-term resource was identified, and we have been able to conclude the representation, which we'll be discussing in part 2.
Okay, so we can declare that complete.
Yes.
And then 073, there was a question around additional prescribing costs that may have been pushed onto general practice as a consequence of the dental situation early on in COVID. Have we got any update on that we're aware of?
Yes, thanks, Mark. So we are still looking into that, and we haven't got the answer. If we can leave it on the log, we will endeavour to solve it before next time.
Okay, thank you. That's great. So, Ed, general update.
Thank you, Chair. So a few updates from me. Starting with, we've got an excellent paper on the agenda around the work we're doing in terms of the what are we missing movement. So we'll hear more about that later. But I just wanted to pay tribute to the progress being made, and in particular that has inspired a really good event in North East Essex, and we've got one coming up in West Suffolk too. Which is great for our system, but additionally, we spoke to the East of England regional meeting on health inequalities with leads from around the region, which Louise and I and Andy Yakub and Dean were present at, and that was really fantastic. There was huge enthusiasm for what we were doing, and people have taken that our work away as sort of something that's quite inspirational and they want to take forward locally. So I just wanted to pay tribute to the work that's not only being done in Ipswich and East Suffolk, but how it is galvanising action elsewhere, because we're generating this with the community. And I think it's just really, really great to see all of that work roll forward. Secondly, I mean, Chair, you referenced the pandemic and the Prime Minister's announcements, what have you. It's quite possible we're going to move back into a response phase as well as the recovery phase. But in terms of recovery, we have submitted our system plan yesterday, and thank you to everyone involved with that. No doubt we'll touch upon it in the meeting, which is largely a green rated plan. There is risk in it, obviously, particularly around the elective and cancer position, but we've submitted, I would say, a strong plan. So thank you everyone involved with that. We're also working hard on our winter plan, and as part of that, flu vaccination and COVID vaccination plans, which Lisa has been involved with, as well as Paul. So a lot of work there. And we submitted our people plan yesterday for the system, which I would suggest we take to a future governing body. And a couple of things there I wanted to pull out is the work that we've supported at the University of Suffolk around it.
Has anyone else found that Ed has Yeah, sorry, Ed.
I'm back. Sorry.
At the last minute. Yeah.
So I'll just take my camera off to improve signal. So, and also a Health and Care Academy, which is launched in Colchester for 16 to 18-year-olds to attract people into health and care roles. We're going to be bringing that into East Suffolk in the coming months. So very excited about that. Jay, no doubt, will talk about the financial allocation. We've got an allocation for the rest of the year based on the spend for the first half of the year, and we're just working through what that means. But that is very much going to be the way of the future, as I understand it, that allocations will be set for the system. And then finally, I just wanted to reference that the King's Fund are doing a major study on place-based working, and they're looking at 4 systems, and Ipswich and East Suffolk system and CCG are being interviewed as part of that work to showcase the place-based approach that we've got on a national footing. So I'm very pleased to have that recognition. Thank you, Chair. Sorry for the interruptions.
Yeah, the vagaries of technology, which is great when it works. So any questions for Ed on any of that, or is there anything that anyone else wants to take an opportunity to update us on? No hands going up, in which case, shall we move into the patient story? And I'd like to invite Louise Hardwick to introduce it, and then Simon is going to cross his fingers and press the play button on a video, and we're all going to hope that it works. Louise, would you like to do the intro?
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everybody. So, Mill, with 17 historic buildings set in 75 acres of beautiful countryside, the Museum of East Anglian Life is the largest independent museum in Suffolk. The museum is an educational charity supporting particularly the community, and they have a particular focus on the production of food and social history reflective of the region's strong agricultural character. Alongside our social prescribing programme, Connect for Health, we commissioned funding to Meal to help enrich people's lives, encourage enjoyment, learning and participation through their public programmes, training and volunteering schemes. They hold events throughout the year, family activities during the holidays, a programme for schools and community-focused initiatives. So the video you're just about to listen to gives a brief overview of the work Meal have done during the lockdown. However, I'd like to update you on particularly on 3 pieces of work that they've delivered during the lockdown. The first one is the Skills Kitchen, and this works with 20 people not in full-time work or education in weekly sessions delivered over 4 months. The programme participants work with museum staff around food businesses and chefs from diverse food cultures to develop practical and soft skills. And the programme has included a range of structured activities designed to give participants working together, challenging themselves and thinking creatively in a supportive environment. And within that, they've got 3 strands of activity around personal development. So they each have a mentor and a coach who supports with career mentoring over the programme. It's focused on job searching, applying for courses and interview skills, but it also helps them with numeracy and literacy sessions focused on the skills needed to work in a business around budgeting, marketing and communication. But also the food businesses and the owners share their experiences, helps develop insider knowledge of the industry, and they also get the participants get accredited food hygiene training and a recognised qualification. And by doing this, they use the museum's produce from their walled garden to help grow and learn about the economy, health and environmental impact of growing food. The second one is around Book a Garden. So as we all know, during COVID, we had a lockdown, and so amidst the museum closure due to COVID, they trialled a Book a Garden scheme in which they offered their back lawn to Stowmarket locals who didn't have access to a garden of their own, or to carers who needed that space and a place to take their clients to get some fresh air and exercise. And so over those sessions, they trialled them, and over 20 participants took part in that. And then they started opening up the sessions because they were so successful. And over the course of the 2 months, they saw 151 adults and nearly 100 children use the back lawn, with one family booking 21 slots for their young sons to run around. So, and then the third one is around Search for the Stars, and that during the lockdown, with many unable to work or study and being stuck at home, MEAL have had a phenomenal increase in engagement with their Search for the Stars project. And they did a year's work in less than 3 months and provided career development and volunteering opportunities, which particularly appealed to people in their 20s. So Search for the Stars aims to transfer the museum's collection data onto an online database, and much of this is done by working with remote or virtual volunteers. And at the height, they had 428 people volunteering on the project. And since lockdown, they've had 164 new remote volunteers, and 80% of these falling in the age 20 to 34 age group. Age group. And this has been a real success. So I'd like to now hand you over to Simon to play the video.
It's just nice to come in during lockdown.
That's fine. No worries.
All good things, technologies.
Yeah.
Good when it works.
What do they say? Never do live television with children or animals. And we can also add into that trying to do live feed from videos. Never mind. Shall we pause that for the moment? Are we able to take that down as well, Simon? Welcome back, everyone. Shall we move on to item 7? And Simon, if you can just give us a nod when you feel technically we're able to go back to that story. I have to say I did go there probably about 18 months or so ago, did a tour around the social prescribing bit, and that Search for the Stars. I went into one of the barns they've got, and the quantity of goods they've got in there that they are photographing and logging is just enormous. So yeah, they've got a big project on there. Imran, Dean, do you want us to take us through item 7?
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think the paper is fairly clear and speaks for itself. Before we kick off, Ed's already referenced the work that's been going on, but I do think it's really important that we recognise Ed's role in this piece of work and how he's taken it up and taken it to other areas and arenas and agendas. And actually, I think we may have said before, but this is about bold and courageous leadership in this space. and I think we have to thank Ed for providing us with that, because it's fair to say that I think the response to the What Are We Missing meetings has not been as universally accepted, I think, as we would have wanted in a lot of our in our systems. And it's particularly the biggest challenging piece, I think, and Dean will probably come in on this as well, is this really, really important drive for co-production, but co-production, you know, in a much deeper and more embedded sense, which I think is challenging some people. There are probably antibodies to co-production in all organisations, particularly at statutory level, where they've had difficulties in the past, but that's probably the biggest challenge for us to overcome. I'll hand over to Dean. Dean?
Yeah, hello all. Yeah, I'd probably concur with everything that that Imran has said, and probably try to paint a picture on why this journey has started and why it's going to be so difficult. The reason why it started is because what essentially has happened is that decades and decades of a very slow pandemic got replaced by a very fast pandemic. The slow pandemic generates more harm. So in terms of the statistics that worry us, it's everything from the infant mortality rate to the maternity mortality rates, but also the huge differential impact on NHS staff and other key workers who have quite a sort of a large proportion sort of from the BAME community. So for one of the first times, we've gotten to a place where the other is us, and the impact on smaller parts of our society is an impact on us. It's not just the right thing to do, but it makes sense on multiple levels. So when COVID hit and pulled the band-aid off that wound that had been sort of festering for some time, many of our leaders thought that something needed to be done about it. We then moved on to, well, there's been lots of efforts to do something about it, and why have they failed so far? Part of the reason that they have failed is, one, the pandemic is slow, but the second reason they have failed is, to be quite honest, mostly down to leadership, and it's a leadership that needs to be servile. It's a leadership that needs to be servant, and in this space, true servant leadership means that you allow the people who are best placed and the people who arguably know best to lead the way. And those are our patients, our key workers, and the people that are reaping the poor outcomes out of this systemic, these problems within our system. So what do we do about it? In a lot of ways, we need to flip the script on us being expert. So because I have melanin in my skin, it doesn't make me an expert on what needs to be done, because at the end of the day, I have a fairly sort of good job. I work for the NHS, and my life is fairly stable. But a homeless Romanian single mother who has a massive impact from this needs to be heard, and that's why we started the What Are We Missing sort of journey. What that has told us is three things. One, we need not only to reach out and listen to these voices because they tell us where we're getting it wrong, but also they are part of the delivery of what we need to do. The second bit is that on this occasion, it probably needs to be fairly strategic. And lastly, we need not to concentrate on activity, what we do, because we are all doing good things in this space, but we need to concentrate on outcomes, and that may unfortunately sort of mean differential investment to change the narrative on a long-term underinvestment in this arena. I think the paper is fairly self-evident, hard to read at times, but we need to go from having feelings of either anger and guilt and move into a strategic place, which is what we're trying to do at the moment. And I'll hand over for questions if needed.
Before we do that, Mark, can I just draw people's attention back, please, to the slide set? And I'd particularly like us to go to slide number, oh dear, hang on, I can never get this to work properly, apologies. It's the slide which lists the 12 Doctors of the World recommendations. As you know, there were 3 key outcomes from the initial, so it's slide 6 in the particular pack, overall slide 27. So there's a list there of the 12 Doctors of the World recommendations. After the first What Are We Missing meeting, there were 3 strong outcomes that we were tasked with making happen. So the first was starting some immediate interventions to support our communities during the end of Wave 1 in preparation for Wave 2. The second was adoption of the 12 Doctors of the World recommendations. And the third, of course, as you know, was the large and slightly more difficult strategic piece that we needed to do. Now, 1 and 3 we're working heavily on. Recommendation 2, which is the 12 Doctors of the World recommendations, as you can see them there, have very kindly, the Doctors of the World have broken them down into who they feel are the relevant bodies and organisations. So just to remind ourselves, as a CCG and a membership organisation, the first recommendation is number 5. So this is enabling access to meaningful primary care for people who otherwise experience exclusion. Recommendation number 7, reopen outreach and drop-in service of people experiencing barriers. Number 10, conduct welfare checks on people in the most vulnerable circumstances. And number 12, actively identify evolving health and social needs of people in vulnerable circumstances and proactively develop supportive interventions. So I think it's very important that we remind ourselves of those, because as a governing body, those are the 12 recommendations, and those particular 4 are the ones that we are being held against. So we are hoping that over the next sort of few months, before we can bring another update back, those are the ones that we'll be challenging our internal system on. And of course, suffice to say, with all the other areas that we're in, we are pushing on those recommendations for the other statutory organisations as well. But that's just really important to highlight those 4 for us as an organisation, and how we need to now make sure we're actually making progress against those 4, as well as all the other bits that we're doing, and the day job, and COVID-19 and recovery and financial planning. Walk in the park.
Thank you. While people are sorting out any questions they want to ask, I sort of had some thoughts as well to share. I mean, the NHS doesn't have the best reputation for acting nimbly or being humble when it comes to major change. And I think what you've highlighted today, and what has been highlighted through the events, is that we need to do something nimble and we need to do something humbly. And it's clear to me that if things are going to be different, something actually has to change. And as you say, the leadership in this and the challenge that we need to provide as leaders, that says if something isn't fit for purpose because the right thing to do is being hindered by it, and whether that's a constitution, for example, that says it's how long you wait, not what the way we assess the need is done. We've got to do the right thing and consider how we do that fairly in this. And it shouldn't be courageous to have to do that. It should be, if anything, courageous not to do it, because it's the right thing that we need to do through this. And if we can help support almost a social change within the NHS around how it needs to function to support the people that it needs to support, then I'm all for that. But what we mustn't do now is step back and go, this is too difficult, or we've got this priority over here that means that we shouldn't continue to make progress on this, which is, been identified as such an important priority for us. Imran?
Thank you, Mark. I think your point's absolutely, and it just raises another bit thought for me, which is a really important one, and it comes back to leadership and Ed's leadership in particular. This is something that we as an NHS organisation can do and make a difference to the lives of those that we're involved with and directly impact. The issue, however, is many of the challenges here are referenced, particularly the wider determinants of health. And we're looking at the sort of peak of the pyramid as to the bits that we can do and the bits that we can solve and the bits that we can support. But for this to become truly, a success, and for us to achieve the real outcomes that we want, this is, as you've said, much wider. This is about societal changes. I think Dean and I have probably come up against the not necessarily the direct, word, but the thought of, when we're challenging people in other areas of statutory life, of public life, and being, almost looked at, well, you're a bunch of doctors, what do you know about policing? What do you know about housing? Well, we don't. But what we do know is that those wider determinants directly impact health outcomes, quality of life, and some of the wider socioeconomic outcomes that we're trying to support and help. And we know that health, when it comes to actually achieving outcomes, is the smallest part of the determinant of someone's quality of life and their life chances and outcomes. It's all the others. And so that's why, again, I sort of reference Ed, really, because he is making this conversation possible and he's supporting that. And we hear the words anchor institutions and integrated care systems and but the question is, what do they really mean? And that's the question, is this about people's lives, or is this about statutory organisational responsibilities and achieving their individual goals? So that's probably the hardest thing that we're trying to achieve.
And I think it's about both, really. And the anchor institution work is really challenging ourselves to think, what can we do for our local people? What can we do to improve social mobility? What can we do to support those where we know that we've got challenges demographically around educational attainment, around age, around all of these things? We have to think differently, just like, the Museum of East Anglian Life has thought differently. Who thought about Book a Garden? We've got to do the right thing, but it's absolutely vital that we do our piece and we all influence for change on those wider determinants of health and not accept the status quo being the status quo. And I think that's where we all have a role to play in this. It isn't just for Ed, it's for all of us to have the opportunity to use our influence, because we do have great influence. The discussion with our local MPs, discussion with our local councillors, don't shy away from the challenge of saying that's not right. We've got an opportunity and we just need to be taking it and take it every opportunity that it comes our way. Anyone else for any more on that item?
Could I come in, Mark?
Yeah.
Thank you. Just to build on a couple of comments being made. So Imran rightly points out that 20% of the influence we can have is around access to healthcare and healthcare services, but the 80% is the bigger piece around the wider determinants. But we've also got to get our side of the street tidy on this. So that 20%, the whole issue about the inverse care law, that poorer communities often get access to poorer healthcare services. Have we taken a proper look at Ipswich and East Suffolk and made sure that that's not the case? And the point about investment, should we be looking at putting more effort into access to services in our poorer communities in Ipswich and East Suffolk? I'm just not clear whether we've done that piece of work, because we've got our role to play, and I want our 20% to be absolutely sorted.
I totally agree, Ed. And if we don't change what we're doing to do the right thing, why should anybody else? So we do have to make that consideration. We shouldn't limit ourselves from a sectional interest that is constitutional bound if that is not the right thing to do. And I think that is the challenge we're putting out to the system, to say that moral courage actually trumps constitutions. And I think that is really important. But if we aren't the change we want to see, who is going to be that? I think we do have to grasp that nettle. We do have to not apologise for saying differential investment is needed. I don't think we need to apologise for that, Dean. Carry on, Dean.
Yes. I mean, it's. I don't think it's as pessimistic and as stark as we paint it, because I think it's the difference between building islands and building bridges. For the first time in a very long time, it is we're all in it together. So the one of the biggest chances of of Ipswich or Suffolk having a lockdown is if one of our key working sites, like the factories, the chicken factory, and those sorts of things, have local sort of outbreaks. So in a lot of ways, for the benefit of us all, I mean, in a very transactional way, we have to work together, and we have to bring sort of these communities into the fold, so that they are not the other, they are us. So I think it's easier than ever to build those bridges and to walk systems around that, those logical steps that need to be taken. At the end of the day, when sort of reviewing the paper, all 9 of the key priorities of the CCG are ticked. Why deal with a prostate cancer at the metastatic stage when a very cheap community intervention can pick it up before it gets anywhere. The same with hypertension, and the same with sort of infant sort of neonatal mortality. So I think for this is a huge opportunity, and I am optimistic. It's very predictable, the resistance that there will be. But I think there are very straightforward ways to get over that resistance, not by bludgeoning people with a finger wag, but just saying this is in all our mutual interest.
And as one of the Garrett Anderson's, was it Garrett Anderson's or suffragette somewhere, said, it's deeds, not words. And that's what we need to do now. So in terms of the next steps for the paper, Imran and Dean, and the importance of seeing actions coming through, how, as the governing body, do you see us being kept informed and kept on the action plan? Dean.
Yeah, I'll probably sort of take that. The really important bit is not particularly what is done, but how it's done. So in a lot of ways, if we're putting together all the research, all the previous strategic pieces, and essentially they give exactly the same answers as the community is giving. The really important bit is that most statutory surveys are completely overstretched. So we need almost a mini army. We need to not only co-produce, but we need to walk through the entire PDSA cycle with our communities, because in a lot of ways, they're the ones that are going to mostly develop, develop and deliver a lot of this. It's not getting to the right answer, it's getting to an answer with the community so that they can co-deliver it to us and we can hold them to account just as they will hold us to account. So the next piece is a strategic piece that will be quite different from previous strategic pieces, where we need some humility in our leadership, where we sit shoulder to shoulder with these communities who are at the wrong end of inequality for whatever reason, and we listen, but they are not only partners in developing, but they'll be partners in all of the PDSA cycles, so that at the end of it, we have communities that are through the voluntary sector delivering this with us. And I think that's going to be a big part of the puzzle in making this different this time, that it is going to be properly co-produced.
Thanks. So in terms of coming back to the governing body, are we going to keep it on for the next one at least?
I would like to.
Yeah.
I think it's reasonable, Mark, but I would suggest that if we don't have anything to bring back, that we may defer the item. We don't want to just keep bringing back for the sake of bringing back. As I say, the challenge for us is we've now got to get real bones, real flesh on the strategic bones that we're looking at, and that's really the key bit for us. And of course, the immediate priorities are becoming more immediate as Wave 2 looms, as well as the Doctors World recommendation. So we've got fair bits of work to do. So we will definitely, if we can keep the slot, and if we don't need, we will defer. But thank you, Mark.
Yeah, no, I think that was what I was recognising, is that whilst this is a long-term strategic goal, it is also got some very immediate requirements. So yeah, fine. Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm now going to cross my fingers and go back to Simon, who tells me that the computer crashed, as we found out, but we're going to have another go. So welcome back to the Museum of East Anglian Life. We hope.
It's just nice to come in during lockdown, because obviously it was get away from what was going on around the world and to have the peace, quiet. For me personally, it's my mental health really. I think if I stayed at home, especially watching the news non-stop, I think I'll just run up the walls. So when you come down here, it was quiet, peaceful, just a little bubble where you got away from it all.
I've been helping with the cleaning out the animals and keeping them clean, feeding them.
Hi. Yes, the lockdown, very important to me because of my circumstances. I needed something to do, and my love for horses was the other alternative. And obviously you can see how gorgeous he is. And it was a pleasure coming in during the lockdown, looking after the lad.
I signed up for the Search for the Stars volunteer project when I was furloughed from my current role. I have always been in study, I've always been in work, I've never really had a period of unemployment, so the prospect of suddenly finding out that I might not be working for a really long time was quite daunting. It was a massive help for me in terms of giving me something to do every day, kind of meaning that I could maintain some sort of routine and mean that I was still challenging myself to work through the records was an absolutely massive help in terms of keeping myself busy. And, you know, I was slightly maybe concerned about, you know, kind of mental health or the impact that lockdown might have if I had absolutely nothing to do. So
during lockdown, we ran a Book a Garden scheme right here on the back lawn of Abbots Hall, making all of this space available to members of the community who needed it the most. We reached out to some of our existing partners, such as Suffolk Family Carers, Acorns Children's Centre, Avenues East and Mid Suffolk District Council, who connected us with families that they work with.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Louise. Any other comments that anyone wished to add? Thank you. And can I just take this opportunity to thank that team at the museum for the work that they've done and the inspiration they've given to their local population and the support they've given them as well. It's great to see that kind of activity happening, and we know that there's so many other equivalent organisations doing great work as well around the county, and at this particular time it has been so much valued. So wherever possible, give what support you can to them. Thank you. Can we move on to item 9, because we seem to be making really good progress through the agenda, and I know Maddie isn't yet on the call. So Paul, can you take us into the procurement update?
Thank you, Chair. This is a fairly self-explanatory paper, and I'll take it as read, but I'd like to say just a few things. As we are attempting to return back to business as usual, procurement clearly is starting to pick up again as a way forward into making sure we have the appropriate services that we require. I'd like to start with the bottom part of the paper, really, and to say that whilst we are still waiting for Brexit and other issues, it is important that we review our policies, and we've started that piece of work. I think it is important that we look at our processes internally, and will be bringing forward a proposal to develop basically a procurement and sort of competition panel to safeguard the whole of SNE and the 3 CCGs in our decision making. And that's really quite important, because whilst nationally it has been signalled there'd be a lighter touch in terms of procurement and competition, those measures still very much remain in place. So it's really quite important that we start looking at that in detail. So my team has started that piece of work. I think the other issues for me is the paper details what the current sort of programme is around procurement. You'll note that stroke and early supported discharge at the date of the 14th of August. I can report that we've had one interested bidder, and we're going through that bit of the process. You'll note that within the paper, the mental health service element is going through an assurance process, which is planned for October. And essentially the other thing that we're currently doing is now working with the transformational team and other CCG teams to make sure we are picking up the advanced programme that is likely to be starting to happen. Now, clearly, a risk is second wave, and we will have to clearly start to think about, should that be an issue, how we manage that differently as we move forward. So we've started that piece of work too. So happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. While we're waiting for any other questions, Paul, I mean, the stroke early supported discharge is really a very important piece of work that needs to be done. We know that we've got some holes that need plugging. We also know that that the Stroke Association produced a report on the impact of stroke recovery during COVID, which you can imagine the impact of rehabilitation as a consequence of COVID being not as good as it could be. There were, however, some really encouraging reports within the body of that Stroke Association report around some of the positive impacts of virtual connection with stroke rehabilitation teams that we should maybe be looking at picking out and seeing what can we do locally to ensure that we're doing as much as we can to support early supported discharge and good rehabilitation. So I just thought I'd flag that.
Thank you, Mark. Just to come back on that, I had a discussion with the procurement team about this particular tender, and I understand this tender is only the first part of a full service redesign. So I think you're absolutely right. I think the work needs to carry on.
Thank you. Any other questions for Paul on that? Don't see any other hands up, in which case we can note that report. Now, I was planning on taking a break, but we're sort of like 40 minutes ahead. Are people happy to press on whilst we wait for Maddie to come back? In which case, shall we go to item 10, the integrated performance report? So, Richard, Lisa, did you want to kick us off?
Chair, would you be happy? Sorry, Paul. Would you be happy for me
Paul
to kick us
well.
off?
Yeah,
and just deal with some of the sort of the harder targets, if you want, and then we can maybe expand in terms of the quality, transformation, and financial agenda, if that's right with my colleagues. Yeah. Okay. So I think just in brief summary of this report, I think we need to see it carry on seeing it in the context of COVID and the impact that COVID has had on performance. Equally, I think that context is likely to carry on, particularly with winter pressures and other challenges that we're likely to see. At the other point I'd like to make it clearly, this report is being scrutinized through clinical scrutiny committee, so I'm sure Imran might have something to say at some of the discussions that may have taken place there. Overall, I think again, in context, we are managing with at least 3 acute organisations that are requiring improvement CQC. I think the report makes that clear. And actually, there are clearly some ongoing work to try and support those organisations to get into good again and move in that direction. In terms of the actual metrics themselves, if I start by looking at cancer, I think generally, whilst we are not hitting all the targets, I think the signs are fairly encouraging. Cancer metrics are overall improving. There are clearly some issues around 2-week wait, and that's a bit variable. There are clearly some issues around 62 days still. The clinical scrutiny committee are planning for a deep dive next time they meet to try and get more into the understanding of what else can be done to improve things. There are some other elements, I think, within the report that are not there. So an email on the 16th September from West Suffolk FT demonstrated that we've gone from 76 patients over 104 days down to 21. And I think the point I'm making is that the system is working really hard to try and tackle those long wait patients and look at the issues and making sure patients are safely managed and catered for. And I think the other issue for me is clearly the relentless focus on capacity that we need to maintain to try and bring cancer services back up to full speed. The biggest risk, obviously, is diagnostics. And whilst we're making some really good progress on CT scan, MRI scanning, and other modalities, endoscopy still remains a challenge because of the COVID issues, and we can't working through that to see if we can improve some of that aspect. So, broadly speaking, I think we are seeing some encouraging signs that cancer, whilst not being where we'd like it to be, is actually managing relatively well given the challenges that we have. The area that I think probably should worry us slightly more than cancer in some respects, and whilst there is still a national regional light touch on it, is RTT. I think you can't fail to see within the report that our referrals are going up, our 18 weeks is getting worse, our waiting lists are actually growing, and essentially, we need to start thinking about how we're going to manage this group of patients. The caveat that I would put to that, though, is that we are clearly at the early phase of our recovery and restoration plans. We've discussed previously the Simon Stevens letter and the fact that we are moving our capacity back to 90% by December of our elective activity, that we're ramping up our diagnostic back to 100% by the same sort of time frame. And again, MRI and CT scan working really well. I think if you look at SNF from memory, they've managed to re-achieve their 6 weeks wait for MRI scans. So a lot of good work is actually happening around some of that. I think the point for me, and I think we've heard the discussion in some form early as part of this meeting, is the fact we're not going to start thinking about we risk stratify the patients, how we manage the most vulnerable patient are managed as best as we can given the challenge that we do have. And there is a piece of work which is being kicked off through the Recovery and Restoration SNE board, which is looking at risk stratification of patients and how we might be able to manage that moving forward. So I guess my point is, whilst we need to keep an eye on RTT, we may need to start thinking what we focus on in terms of the output that we need to see to make sure and assure ourselves that our patients are being safely managed. So I just draw your attention to that really as an issue. In terms of mental health, again, whilst not where we might like it to be, I think there are some early indications that things are marginally improving. So if you look at an SFT, sort of 11 indicators we sort of look at, 3 remained about static, 8 have all marginally improved. Having said all of that, as activity returns back to normal, we need to keep a watching brief, and we are doing that through having fully reinstated the sort of quality performance and contract meetings that we routinely have with our providers. And just as a point of note, with regards to an SFT, I've been invited to their Finance and Performance Committee, and I'll now be a regular member of that committee to try and influence how we improve services. So some really good partnership working, really starting around some of that and trying to focus on some of those aspects. Last 2 bits that I would point to really are your patient transport, your ambulances. Whilst patient transport at ESEC have managed relatively well, there is still a spectre of increased activity, winter pressure. So again, the teams are engaging with us providers to make sure that we actually try and keep on top of this possible sort of a deterioration in the performance where we'd like it to be. And in terms of ambulance service, I would just point you to category 2 responding, which is actually slightly worsened. And again, we're having discussion to see what we can do in terms of winter planning and winter pressure, and how we can prevent a further deterioration of those tendencies. So I suppose I'll stop there at that point. Happy to answer any questions that I can, or to bring back any answers should I need to, and open it to my colleagues who may want to contribute on the quality, transformation and financial agenda.
Thank you, Paul. Lorna, you've raised your hand, and then Imran.
Just as a comment, I'd just like to say that I'm sure the clinicians in the acute trusts are very, very aware of the clinical priority of their patients and are pushing very, very hard for people who have got life-threatening conditions.
Absolutely.
And that will be having an impact on other areas of the hospital which are doing more straightforward elective work, which is not life-threatening. And we're definitely beginning to see that. And the other thing is that many more processes have been introduced as a result of COVID to try to keep patients and pathways necessarily separate sometimes, more downtime between procedures, more cleaning between procedures. And I think it will be quite a long time before we get back to where we were, I would say. I think that, there's a lot of PPE put on, taken off, and all this just adds, another 10% to the process. And I think that we need to be realistic about what we might be able to achieve.
Agreed.
Thanks, Lorna. Imran and then John Oates.
Yeah, two things, Paul. I think picking up on Lorna's point, I think it's really important. We're getting a lot of patients at the moment who are coming along saying, my referral was sent, 8, 9, 10 months ago. What is going on? And each time it's that individual conversation. Look, there's lots of pressures. Everything has changed. You can't do 5 MRIs back to back. You've now got to have cleaning time, downtime, prep time, all of this that's making the whole system much, much harder. And I guess what I was trying to say is, is there some really strong system comms that we can get out there, not just to help ease some of the pressures and things, but actually to get a really clear upfront understanding and supporting patients in their distresses and things, and something that comes out jointly from the CCG and the providers that says, we're absolutely trying to prioritise, we're supporting, we're working hard, but the reality of the system is that this is now what our new norm is. And I think it would be really good to get those out and make sure they're out in every forum, and maybe do some innovative things like, put them in pubs so that people can see them before 10 o'clock, joking. But, radio, TV, anything that we can do to get out there, I think will be really, really beneficial for some of that distress and anxiety. And my second question was just one around the Nuffield, really, and how they're doing and how we're performance managing them and the finances, and, how much more time, etc. we've got there, really, just as a question.
Yeah, so if I may just come back on the first point, absolutely, point really well made. I think in terms of comms, I think my slight hesitation is we probably need to decide how we're going to manage it in the first place, so we can give some clear messages to patients. Clearly, I believe there is some national guidance just about to come out in terms of how we might actually need to do that, and there are some regional groups looking at that at the moment. So absolutely correct. I think there needs to be some comms how we manage, and essentially 3 ways you manage a situation like this. I think one is you look at demand slightly differently and manage to protect patients in a slightly different way rather than referrals, and I think that's something we need to get into in more detail. The other is increasing capacity, and again, your question on private sector is absolutely correct. We are working with the private sector locally and both nationally in terms of trying to increase that capacity to try and get on top of things. But realistically, you're looking 120, 130% of capacity to be able to try to capture, and that's a huge, difficult ask given workforce, given all the COVID constraints and all of that. And the third bit for me, and again, is, as I said earlier, is what is our focus in terms of harm to patient? How do we manage that? And that you ping in the comms to that in a sense. In terms of Nuffield, there are some clear plans that the private sector have signed up to. There are some clear plans between West Suffolk, for example, and Nuffield. I think there are some challenges, if I want to be really honest. They're not running to the full capacity we might expect them to be. That is relating to workforce, that is relating to all sort of other issues. The only issue that I can give is that we are meeting on a weekly basis with the private sector and West Suffolk FT and SNF and other private providers to tease out and sort out some of those issues that are preventing full utilisation of the capacity that we have.
Thank you. John or Richard, did you want to come back with something, or have you got something that you want to raise?
Just quickly on Imran's point too, in terms of what Paul said as well, SNF has sent a letter out to all patients on the waiting list explaining the situation, which we saw in advance. So we had some involvement in making sure that went out, and West Suffolk FT have followed in that vein with similar letters. So it's basically it's not perfect, but it's a holding statement just trying to explain what's happening to patients in terms of the backlog, etc. And then secondly, Simon, I don't think Simon's left the conversation, but Simon Morgan's been developing with all the comms leads across the health and care system a comms plan linked to winter, but more broadly elective recovery, which is coming to the next SNE elective recovery group in a week and a half's time. So what I'll do is I'll make sure Simon circulates that through to the executive, so we might have a conversation there. So just to give you some assurance, Imran, yeah, there is work happening on that.
Thanks, Richard. John, and then Maddie.
Thank you. It's good to hear that we are focusing on disproportionate impact of COVID on vulnerable and communities requiring sort of equity adjustments. But I just heard about the BMA challenges and our strategy around that. I'm sure it's just shorthand, but I didn't hear how patients are involved with co-production to lift up the awareness through communities to us as an active thing, rather than as a SNE board to identify vulnerabilities.
Thank you, John. Any response to that? So that this is about ensuring that our communication with communities is correct, that it's understandable. That's the point you're making, is it, John?
Not only that, in people, as Dean was saying, engaging people in empowering them to tell us what they need and coming forward. So it's a two-way communication strategy, not a one-way vulnerability data assessment. Yeah,
thank you. Maddie, did you want to come in on that as well as raising an issue?
It's just linked. So there was a very positive proposal from Angela Tillett, the medical director at ESNEFT, at the Alliance Board last week about working with our district colleague councils to think about ways in which individuals could be supported in their community by their community whilst waiting, just recognising that there will be a wait. So I thought it was an absolutely wonderful opportunity for a partnership between the acute and communities, and we'll be taking that forward together.
Thanks, Maddie. Imran, have you put your hand up again? Should I go to Pete?
Hi, just a couple of things. First of all, I got not much to add to Paul's excellent exposition of the situation with cancer, and I think I'd echo that it's actually a tribute to all the hard work that's gone on, that the figures are actually as good as they are. It's also relevant to point out that despite, and in contrast to the still national picture, 2-week wait referrals are back up to pre-COVID levels in our CCG, so it's not a case that ESNEFT is actually dealing with a lesser workload. It's actually dealing with a pre-COVID workload, which is absolutely right. So it makes their figures need to consider those in that light. I would also add, throughout COVID and ongoing, we've had regular oversight from the Cancer Alliance on our cancer performance and our cancer plans, and it's a sign that those meetings have gone from weekly to fortnightly, now to monthly as an oversight. The other thing I'd add is it's very easy to blame all the problems with cancer on COVID, and I don't think that is the case, particularly in true of the 104-day waiters. There's more other factors at work, and I think that's one of the things that perhaps we need to get right, is the clinical oversight of those long waiters and making sure that they're coming to harm. A principle which I think also applies in the elective care arena, especially as we move towards clinical prioritisation. It is very important that we have a system of robust review of patients waiting on PTLs to ensure that they don't come to clinical harm. That is a huge challenge for us as a system.
Can you explain PTL, Pete?
Patient tracking, code word for waiting lists. Sorry. Yeah, it's patients referred to hospital. As I say, especially if we go down the road of clinical prioritisation, which I'm sure is absolutely right, and something that we've already done with cancer pathways, particularly the colorectal pathway. But we need to have a robust system that those patients that don't necessarily go to the top in the clinical prioritisation, whatever it is, do not come to further clinical, both physical and mental harm whilst they're waiting.
Thanks, Pete. Richard, do you want to come back?
Just very quickly to add to what Pete said, on the those waiting 104 days, or even between 63 days and 104 days, the Trust have committed to effectively ending that or bringing it right back down to where they were pre-COVID by the end of October, and they're doing really well. Obviously, any patient waiting that long is not good, but they are bringing it down weekly. I can't remember the exact figure. We got one on Friday. But they are on track to do that within the next 3 to 4 weeks, which is good news for patients.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact figures either, but it's from triple digits to double digits.
Yeah,
that kind of improvement.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight some NHS benchmarking data that Ed had been sharing with me around particularly mental health crisis activity, where we seem to benchmark very, very low in Suffolk compared to national. That may, of course, be different with the fact that the crisis line has come live more recently, but just to ensure that everyone is assisting with mental health crisis. Richard?
So the latest numbers that were presented yesterday at the Mental Health Board was that the numbers have gone up to 150 a day from 100, so it is climbing. What I would say on the flip side, though I'm not entirely sure this is definite, is that if you've got your services right, that's why I'm saying not definite, you wouldn't necessarily see the same levels of crisis. I'm not saying we're definitely there yet, but the numbers are definitely higher and growing from where we planned for within the crisis line.
Thanks. Was that your kettle going in the background there, Richard? No? Okay.
I have a hot tap, Mark. Sorry, I don't have a kettle.
Or was it someone whistling for the dogs? Okay, thanks very much. Are we going to move into provider areas now, Richard?
Well, I think Paul started as a general overview. So
yeah.
Paul's lead with, I think each of us will just give you a kind of a note, because they all interlink so heavily, rather than going through one by one. But then I guess we can answer any questions pertaining to any of the providers as part of that.
Yeah, okay. Carry on.
So I'll just go through any issues relating to individual providers that I think need to be escalated. There's a huge amount of detail in the performance pack. So ESNEFT, probably the key area that we're working with ESNEFT on is both the Maternity Transformation Programme. So ESNEFT have now developed plans to roll out their continuity of carer model, which you'll all be aware we've had presentations at board before around the significant impact that having a continuity of midwifery carer makes to women and partners going through pregnancy and childbirth. And the plans are that ESNEFT have now developed are to roll out 100% of their midwifery teams into continuity of care teams by the end of March. So we're just having monthly oversight meetings with ESNEFT to track their delivery of that. But that's excellent news for women and families and children in Suffolk and North East Essex. ESNEFT are also just developing their patient safety implementation plan. So you will be aware the Trust is part of our system for early adoption of the National Patient Safety Framework, which has been a huge piece of work to be early adopters for that framework. And I'm really proud that ESNEFT and indeed all our providers have managed to keep this piece of work on track during the last few months. So they've developed their plan, they've identified the themes that they will be investigating in the future. We're just waiting for that plan to go to their board, and then we'll take it through our own governance. But it looks a very robust plan that we've seen in draft so far. I won't talk any more about cancer. I think that's been well discussed, but obviously we're working as an MDT on the cancer and to understand patient harm from any cancer weights.
So West Suffolk Hospital, we are keeping oversight of their CQC improvement plan. We have a well-led inspection, which we're doing jointly with the regional NHSEI team this Friday, where we'll be doing clinical visits through neonatal, maternity and ED to understand the maternity pathways. And we have a number of discussions planned for the senior leaders of maternity services, both board leaders and divisional leaders with the regional team. We also have a quality assurance visit planned to test the medicine management actions that were raised as part of CQC inspection, which they believe are closed. As part of the improvement board, we provide the external assurance, the independent assurance that they to test that they have embedded those medicine management and storage issues. And we also have a quality visit planned to review the care and treatment of people with learning disabilities following a number of serious incidents that have triggered a level of concern, both with us and the trust, that we just want to understand better and test their decision-making processes for people with learning disabilities. NSFT, so you'll see in the report that the access and assessment team waiting times have been a concern, but the waiting list is now reduced significantly. So we have had some strong oversight on that, but it's now reduced from 800 to 150, which is good. We, again, working with the trust to understand the increased demand on acute services, particularly first episode of psychosis, although we're seeing a low uptake in access to early intervention psychosis service, which was discussed at the contract meeting a couple of weeks ago, and the team are going to do a deep dive into that work to understand why the EIP service isn't being accessed before we see the first episode of psychotic patients being admitted into acute services. As an MDT, we've spent quite a bit of time with the new CYP leadership team. They are doing a really good review of all their services and identifying how their priorities and how we work with them going forward. The emotional wellbeing hub, we've seen some really good performance. I think some of that is related to decreased referrals, but they are reporting 86% response to referrals within 10 days, which is, as you all know, on the journey we've been with the emotional wellbeing hub is significantly better than where they have been in the past. And yes, so the leadership team are really embedding into the system and are doing a really good job. The other piece of work that they're helping us with is understanding, as part of the neurodevelopmental pathway, what some good outcome measures for children and young people with autism and ADHD assessment and treatment will be. At the moment, we just are measuring assessment times, and as you will know, assessment of autism can take many months. We have a KPI at the moment which measures them against an 18-week access time, and sometimes it's not in the child and young person's best interest to go through the process within 18 weeks. It's sometimes, because of the observational measures, takes a lot longer. So we really want to move to a more outcome-based measure with looking at children and young people with challenging behaviour. So that's part of the work that we're also working with our SEND board on to help them to understand that sometimes the performance for ADHD and autism is not looking great, but the measures are something that are in development and need to improve. And the final provider that I think it's just worth giving an overview of, a brief summary of, is the ambulance service, E-East. So my safeguarding team continue the oversight and challenge with safeguarding allegations. You'll remember there were 85 at the beginning of the year, safeguarding allegations. We're now overseeing 16 with the trust. We have reported before that the CQC have undertaken an unannounced well-led inspection. We don't have the final report of that yet. We believe it's with the Trust for factual accuracy checking, and will be published in the not too distant future. However, with NHSEI, we have, as a stakeholder group with Healthwatch and HEE, agreed an action plan to support E-East with some of the key issues that we are anticipating will come out of the CQC report. So I think that's probably the key things to pull out of the quality section, but happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Can't see any hands up. Is there anyone want to make any comments or ask any other questions? Ed.
Yeah, because testing is obviously a very topical theme, and I don't think we've talked about it yet. But just a reference for Pillar 1 testing, ESNEFT, by the end of October, will be offering 3,000 tests a day, up from about 1,200 a day currently. So that's really, really good news. But obviously for our community, and I know there are members of the public watching this live stream, there is still a lot of anxiety around Pillar 2 testing, isn't there? So I don't know, Lisa or Paul or any colleagues wanted to make any comments on testing.
So as you say, Ed, it is a real concern. It's impacting on kind of most of our providers, and also obviously the people in Suffolk. It's impacting on care homes. So a quick resolution of our testing capacity and ability to test quickly is an absolute requirement as we go into winter.
Indeed, and the ability to test locally, not have to drive a 400-mile round trip, would be preferable as well. And you know, the essential piece here is about the confidence of the public in being able to have a test, understand the consequence of the test result, and to be able to take the right actions and not avoid actions that may have negative impacts as a consequence of the way the system handles them, be that denying easy access or being over punitive when you know, that could potentially prevent somebody from making a decision that they need to do the right thing and have the test. And I think that is really important for us to understand, and really important for key decision makers to understand. Imran.
Just picking up on that point, Mark, I think it really is powerful and ties in very strongly with some of the concerns that we heard from some of our BAME groups, where, you know, testing carries, and potentially a positive test carries, so much stigma, not just in the community, but actually from a work point of view, because of the massive knock-on impact it has on those and their finances. So it's really important that we get the messages and then the subsequent support out to those communities, and that's support both for employers and the employees who are in quite difficult situations. And the other bit about that is the key part around testing of our wider NHS family, and we know that there's been some significant challenges, and we know that ESNEFT are doing everything they can. Capacity seems to be the main challenge there, but we are assured that they're working really hard to get a turnaround, which means that you know, the system can stay afloat, and we're not losing huge amounts of our staff to the risk part of the system.
Yeah, and it adds risk when waiting time means that people don't get a result and can't contribute to the way the system performs and delivers service for our local residents. That is very important. Lolu,
just to follow from that, I think it's really important that while testing is a national problem and the capacity is a national issue, that what is being done about it locally is communicated very clearly, so that it's it doesn't just seem like, well, it's just something happening out there and we all have no control. Having just gone through the process as an NHS staff member for a family member in the last 2 weeks, it's so frustrating not to know what's happening locally to be able to resolve the problem, even if that is all that's being said is we're working, that there is something being done and it should come into play by this amount of time. I can imagine that would alleviate a lot of anxiety and help people to do the right thing, because even in my household with a GP in the household and young children, the pressure of them saying everyone is well, why are we still at home? I can imagine if my husband had a job that required him to, that he only got paid if he went to work on a daily basis, the pressure to just sort of say, well, actually, we can't get the test and we've tried and we've done everything and, everyone go to work would be really high. And more probably for people whose incomes are much lower and they, maybe only have one income coming in, they probably would just do that. So I think it's really important, going back to Imran's point about communication up to the BAME communities, but also just to everyone, that this is what's being done locally. Yes, there's a national problem, but this is what is being put in place, whether it's at ESNEFT, communicating ESNEFT if they even are running out, being able to communicate back to the NHS staff and saying, we have this amount of capacity, we got your request, but we're going to get back to you. All of that is really important to ensure that this process works.
It's Paul and then Maddie.
Just to add to the conversation, we received an email this morning saying that Suffolk City Council, in response to the challenge of COVID testing, are putting on some additional testing facilities in Martlesham to support our critical care workers, which I think is good news. So again, I think that there's clearly a system response in terms of what we can do about this issue. Clearly not enough, but actually a system response nonetheless. Thank
you. And it's good to hear that we can take pragmatic steps and not just be bound by anything that's dogmatic. Maddie and then John. Have you put your hand down, John?
Thank you. And Lolo, I'm sorry to hear about the difficulties that you had. And I think some further options, as Paul has highlighted, have come online, which is really, really helpful. I think, but related to that is the point about communications. And I suspect we've now reached a point where we need to reintroduce some of the daily communications that we had, which I think were very, very well received at the time. We did reduce those slightly, but I think it might be timely to bring those back to a more frequent basis so that everybody does know how to access tests and have the access to other support services that they need as we move into winter time. So I'll take that action.
Thank you. Anything more on that small minefield of testing? Thank you, Ed, for bringing it and reminding us of the joy of testing. In which case, shall we move on within the performance report? Jane, are we over to pounds and pennies or?
Yes, we certainly can do. So just as a reminder,
you off, Richard.
Sorry, Richard. So just as a reminder that we are working in an unusual financial situation insofar as the finances for the CCG have been nationally dictated, and the payments that we make to our local providers in particular, such as ESNEFT, normally we would be negotiating those, looking at service developments, but for this part of the year up to the end of September, these have all been centrally calculated and determined for us. So it is what we are reporting on is effectively the finances that are flowing through the CCGs and how they are affected. The good news in all of that is that the NHS has obviously been given a commitment that it will be given the funding that it's needed, and the way that that works for the CCG is that we pull together our expenditure for each particular month, and then we apply for a retrospective top-up, mainly relating to our costs associated with the COVID response but for anywhere within the CCG where we are not able to break even. So the idea is that for that period up to the end of September, CCGs, along with our local trust partners, will be funded to for the costs that we incur. Now, they are subject to review by region and also a series of audits, which I'll talk about in a later paper. But effectively, as long as those tests are passed, then the CCG receives a reimbursement. So the report itself is reporting on the period up till the end of August. We were reporting against allocations that we were given for the first part of the year that were based broadly on last year's spend plus a little bit of inflation lower than we were due to receive as part of our general allocations for this year. And within that, you can see in the report that our year-to-date allocation has been exceeded slightly in the month. So we will be applying for a retrospective top-up allocation of 1.6 million, most of that relating to COVID expenditure. There are some highlights of the report on the narrative, the second page, that takes you through the key variances within that. Most of those would just relate to the way that that those allocations and those particular budgets were calculated centrally for us. So there are ups and downs within that. The main ones to point out really are around the variance in primary care that relates particularly to prescribing costs that were incurred very much at the start of COVID. We saw a really significant increase in prescribing costs in the April data, partly due to, we think, sort of stocking up and people dealing with how to deal with medicines over the COVID response. That has slowed down. We've got the figures for the subsequent couple of months, which have reduced slightly, but we are keeping a close eye on that as we go through the year. So I'll pause there, Chair, if I may, and just see if there are any questions.
Maddie, do you want to come in?
Thank you. I think it probably is just appropriate to come in with respect to the prescribing. So, I mean, we are monitoring very, very carefully. We did have, as Jane described, a significant increase and an expected and very reasonable increase at the start of the COVID period, where people were diligently, I think, ordering, not knowing the kind of situation and how it would unfold. We did then have a reduction, I suspect, as people were using up any supplies that they had ordered. It has, however, started to upturn again. So we are working across the whole and with the practices on what we've described as a prescribing restart scheme in order just to fully understand the position and to reduce waste in every way that we can, because waste is dangerous and it costs. So it's really important that we take that action, and I'm grateful for the kind of energy that the practices are putting into that, a time when there's many competing priorities. So we're very committed to continuing to look at this for the reasons of safety and quality and cost.
Thanks, Maddie. Anyone got any other questions on the finance at the moment? We've got a number of papers coming through, as the agenda moves forward. In which case, Maddie, did you want to just complete anything from a primary care perspective that's within the performance report?
Thank you. So, I mean, just 3 points to highlight. I had to go a fourth, which related to prescribing, but we've done that. Thank you. So, just to say that primary care services are positively resuming. I mean, there wasn't actually a point at which they were sort of stopped. There's always been a variety of ways in which people can access their services, both via remote consultation, and now there is increasing face-to-face, and that's positive. I think that's relates to patient need and to the response of the practices. So that's very positive. We are a little behind in terms of LD health checks and in terms of dementia diagnosis. That is as a result of the lockdown period, but both of those are positively resuming now as well. So that's good. And my third point really would be about the flu. So an absolute priority within primary care is to encourage people to come forward safely, which they absolutely can, to have their flu vaccination. The practices will advise individuals to come forward at the right time. We've had some very successful clinics so far, and that will continue as we move forward. So you'll see lots of communication about that. I think within Ipswich and East Suffolk and across NE, under Lisa's leadership, we've got a very robust plan, and we would just encourage people at the right time, as called, to come forward for that vaccination. Thanks.
Thank you, Maddie. Any other questions for Maddie on that? In which case, Richard.
Thank you, Mark. Always the wit. So I'll just take you through the main headlines for the transformation programmes. So in terms of the integrated care programme, we're currently rated amber, which I think is reasonable in terms of where we are due to some of the delay with the original programmes. Just to give you some headlines, positive development is that ESNEFT and West Suffolk have started their consultation with community staff about moving the service to 7 days a week till 8 p.m. in the evening. You recall a couple of years ago when we did the most capable provider process, that was one of the key development points that we put within the model. So I'm really pleased that that consultation is now underway and hoping to shift to the new time model from next year, early next year, which would be great. Some other progresses around the programme. We'll be bringing a business case, Paul and I, to the next executive around Think 111 First, which is the national development that has come out, where they're trialling in three or four places in England, bolstering 111 so that they try and get a 20% minimum shift of activity from A&E, the walk-ins, to effectively try and get people to use 111 so they try and reduce flow going into the acute. It's early days, I think it's fair to say, in terms of how that's working in other parts of the country, but we're being asked by NHS England to develop the model with a look to implementing from early December, and you may have seen it in the local EADT, Nick Hume and others speaking about that development. So we'll talk more at the executive once we've got the business case coming through. In terms of care homes, another positive thing you'll see within the pack is that I think all but a handful of homes have now had the training and the camel lifting equipment, nice name, which is excellent in terms of that investment that we look to make within the homes, which should reduce falls and etc. So that's really positive. In the middle of COVID to have done that is amazing. And then finally, on that programme, we've also had the agreement, I think, Mark, through the Integrated Care Board, to move REACT into its next phase, which is dispersing it out into a number of hubs and spokes, Maddie's nodding as well, across Ipswich and East, which is exactly in line with our strategy longer term around the integrated neighbourhood teams development, rather than having everything in one location in Ipswich. So that work's underway. Paul's already covered quite a bit of the elective care programme. We've got a green rating there, which I think is probably optimistic. I would prefer amber in terms of where we're finding ourselves. But against the specifics of the programme, they're broadly on track. So a lot of the work the teams do at the moment is, I wouldn't say it's transformation in the way that we would look historically. It's how are we going to recover our services through using different means to do that, be it virtual consultations, be it the good newsletter, be it Blue Card, etc., etc. So you'll see in the highlight report that the team have been dispersed into the various service areas in the hospital to support them in getting all those elements embedded. I'm trying to push that's done. The timeline was March, which I think is too far away. I was keen that we get this embedded for winter, so then that we can move the team on to other stuffs, which I know Pete's also keen to ensure happens. In terms of these, we call it the strategic programmes, so Narinda's areas, just a couple of areas. So on stroke, you'll recall the early supported discharge procurement that was paused has now restarted, and we're in the thick now of that process, looking to have the service recommencing its new form from April, which I think we're still on track to hit. Maternity, which Lisa leads, there is and Lisa might come in at the end, there is a risk around the finances for that programme that we're still bottoming out. So we're reprofiling what is possible within a potential reduced funding envelope. And that's a similar picture for cancer, where we've now had the Cancer Alliances had their funding envelope, and within the next week or so we should know exactly how much money Suffolk and North East Essex will get, and then we'll need to reprofile our local cancer transformation programme. Just while on the theme of cancer, we had our SNE Cancer Board last week, and one of the main focus areas we're now looking at again is early diagnosis. So I'm not disputing we need to carry on our recovery, it's incredibly important, but I'm keen that we get back to doing some of the longer term transformation work that we committed to. So Caroline Angus, in her new Head of Innovation role with EASHN, Eastern Academic Health Science Network, is plotting for each cancer type, what are we doing in terms of early diagnosis, and then working with Pete and others on prioritising what potential innovations could we put in place which tackles early diagnosis through the prism of health inequalities, so linking back to the earlier item. So we may have, and I'm keen that we may have a differential approach across the ICS where we target certain interventions in certain areas, both to tackle health inequalities in their broadest sense, which will be good. On the Children and Young People's programme, apologies, I don't know what's happened. There's a slide missing because you've only got the North East Essex updates there. But just briefly on the CAMS work, by the end of September, we should then have a full suite of pathways finished for the mental health CAMS work. And we've got a deep dive being planned for October for Alan and Stuart as the two SROs to come and present where they've got to with all elements of that work programme. And the neuro procurement, which I keep saying is restarting, my understanding from speaking to Gary is that looking at an October restart for that £700,000 the board agreed to invest in pre and post diagnosis support. We've paused it partly because of COVID and partly because we wanted to see with schools coming back, get that back more and then start. So we're due to start that imminently. And then just to finish on mental health, we had our mental health board meeting last night, which went, Maddie and Lisa and others were there, went well, I think. We're broadly on track with where we need to be. One of the main things that, just to update you on, is on crisis, that we will be bringing, or Paul will be bringing, the outcome of the assurance process at the next board meeting in November to make a decision around the model and the commissioning recommendation for crisis services for mental health. And we're in the process of developing two business cases, one for personality disorder, which Lulu Preston and our team are working on from NSFT, and the second one is IAPT. We need to ramp up even more, particularly in light of COVID and recovery, the potential number of individuals who could go through that service model. So we've commissioned up to 25%, which meets the national ask. We're looking to go further. So both of those business cases will be coming through the executive in November and then through to the governing body, dependent on the level of investment required. So that just gives you a bit of an overview, Mark, and board members where we are. But I think just to say we're trying to balance both recovery and keep going with some of the longer term work. And I think we're with any, back to talk about risk, with any new spike or difficulty around operations, we'll need to take stock again, as we always are, about what we can and cannot balance with the immediate pressures.
Thanks, Richard. I think we've been served well by holding our nerve on managing the long-term strategic plan that we have had and using the COVID impact to accelerate the changes that we wanted to see. And I don't see any need for us to diverge from that. So it's really good to have seen that acceleration and use the opportunities when they arise to do it well. Thank you. And any questions for Richard on the transformation part? Lisa.
Just to clarify, as Richard said, we are still also waiting for the final sum of money that we're going to get for Maternity Transformation to spend within this financial year. We have heard on the grapevine that it will probably be 50% less than we were expecting. So, yeah, but we still don't know what that's going to be.
Okay, well, we'll keep our fingers crossed on that one as well. Anything else? Have I missed anybody from the performance report? Always like to finish on a positive with Richard's transformation work. Great. So shall we do our little pause now? We've got to 11 o'clock. And then, Maddie, we've been waiting with bated breath and expectation. So it'll be great to get your emergency food item done as soon as we meet again. So can I say 6 minutes past 11, we will restart again. So if you can switch cameras off, there's going to be a board come up, and we'll meet again shortly. Thank you. Okay, so I'm hoping that everyone is going to be back and we can take down our on a break screen. That's fantastic. So if you can all switch cameras back on, that helps me understand that we're all there. Thank you. Now then, Maddie, I was bigging you up about your paper. We're going to go back to paper 8 on the emergency food fund.
Thank you.
So,
And
do you want to take us through it?
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry I wasn't here right at the beginning. I was part of a flu meeting with NHS England. So thank you. And I think just as a reminder, this began in 2019 and was led by Ed. And I think it's a really, really important development for us as a clinical commissioning group to understand the relationship between access to healthy food and good food, regular food, and health. So that's the first point to make. Second point is to say thank you to Louise Hardwick, who's managed this since then in partnership with Suffolk Community Foundation. So thank you. As a reminder at the outset of the paper that income and poor nutrition are key causes of ill health. And we have a 12-year drop in life expectancy between our most deprived and least deprived areas, 12 years. And 28% of children in Ipswich are living in poverty. So this is a really, really important part of our work as a clinical commissioning group. So Suffolk, as I mentioned, Suffolk Community Foundation managed this for us and offered grants of between £10,000 and £2,000. And what's clear through this is the difference that this relatively small amount of money can make to individuals. And I'm not going to go through each of them. We had a wonderful presentation when we met, which felt long ago, in Stowmarket from one of the providers, one of the organisations in Witton in Ipswich, who talked about some of the summer food clubs and activity clubs that they were able to offer through this. But you can see through this the diversity of the initiatives that were supported and the impact on individuals' lives. And what struck me when I reread them was the importance of the food, but also in reducing social isolation and bringing people together. And I know now that that's much more difficult, but some of these programmes have been able to continue through deliveries. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that this was not possible because we weren't able to maybe meet in groups again. There are other ways in which these services have been continued throughout this period. So, as I say, I won't go through all of them, but you can see the different programmes and the different geographies, the different communities that were reached. So I'll go to the kind of what happens next, because fundamentally all of the money has been spent that we allocated through this, and that's a good thing. We're pleased about that. However, where next? So Community Action Suffolk are leading a piece of work to understand the current position of all of Suffolk's food banks and associated programmes, and that will report to the Suffolk Community Collaborative Communities Board. I knew I'd get that wrong. The Collaborative Communities Board, which Louise is a member of. And that will also, we hope, be feeding into the Food Justice Plan. So that's a really important piece of strategic work. And what we are proposing is that the findings from that piece of work are brought back after they've been to the Collaborative Communities Board, to the clinical exec, and onward to the governing body, because I'm sure that we still have a really important role to play in ensuring that people have access to food through the types of programmes that have been ongoing over the last year. So I'm very happy to take any questions, but that's the recommendation really of this paper, is to note what has happened, but also to receive another report on the basis of the Suffolk-wide work, which is now underway. Thank you.
Thanks, Maddie. Did anyone have any particular questions or observations that they wanted to make about this? I mean, it was a great piece of work. I think the things that it's highlighted to me is firstly understanding the importance of how we work with our voluntary sector, and as you know, strengthen the partnerships that we have, and what value that can bring, not just from a monetary financial term, as we saw with what they can then add to what we as public institutions can give, but it gives value where we would probably never have otherwise been able to contribute effectively, and there's a link back to the work with the BAME community here, that we need to be humble and giving about that we've not done it in that way before. So I think that's been really important, and I think it'll be even more important as we go through the recovery post-COVID, whenever that occurs, and the natural support we need to give our communities to support themselves. So I've got some hands up. John first, then Ed, then Lolly.
Well, I mean, first of all, I just want to say thank you for the foresight that has got us engaged in this excellent and valuable endeavour, as you've just described, Mark. I suppose my standing question here is how do we ensure that the sort of best social outcomes come from investing in this way in prevention and deprivation? And moreover, how do we account for that with our other statutory bodies and providers to ensure that we continue to put the money in the right places to solve the problems of those most disadvantaged, or those with challenges with equity in our society?
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Maddie, for the report. I just reflecting back when we launched this piece of work, there was quite a bit of pushback as why is the NHS investing money in food? And I think the case has been made really well by the paper, and also what we've learned during COVID is that this is important. But I think the point you made about food being social is a really good one. And I think, you know, John's just reflected on that too, is just the wider benefits of bringing people, communities together around food at a time when people are experiencing a lot of hardship and loneliness. I think it has a huge impact. So I think that's certainly something that I didn't expect from this piece of work, is how strongly the social aspect has come through.
Thanks, Ed. Lolly?
Thanks, Chair. Just to reiterate, I think really the real importance of this work, and with my sort of CYP hat on, and a bit of mental health, I spent a bit more time with the gentleman who came to present to us at Stowmarket. I went to visit where they actually run the program, and they told me the stories of the things that the families that were impacted, and the things. This was all before COVID. And the children that were being reached. I think it's more crucial more than ever, and so I'm really, really glad to hear that it's going to the Community Collaborative Board and going to be continued, because the impact that this makes in a time where, you know, there are more children, especially if we go into another lockdown. We know that there were more children subject to, you know, who would have been in difficult situations, the situations of neglect, where there were safeguarding concerns and things like that, where sometimes the only meals they would get in the holidays would be programs like what was run by the Whitton Youth Partnership. So it's really, really important work. It's not something that we can, and I just going back to what Ed said, is definitely not something that health should step out of and say it belongs to somebody else. We definitely have a role to play here, and I'm glad that that's going to continue.
Thank you. Maddie and then Dean. You're on mute, Maddie.
I probably am going to repeat what others have said, but maybe it really is important in terms of emphasis. So I think that this is everybody's business, and it's not just a single statutory partner. So I do think this is absolutely important for the clinical commissioning group. That's the first point. The second point is I think it's very important that we learn from this. It's part of our journey of working with communities to understand need and how to understand what the best and most creative response is. And I think, that's been a really important part of this journey. And I suppose just to emphasise, I think, we need to come back. We'd like to come back because we need to take the learning that the community Action Suffolk are finding and from the Collaborative Communities Board, and I think that will mean coming back with a financial request for the future. And last but not least, as we've said, there is a really important social dimension to this and addressing social isolation, and I think that we need to turn to our community groups to think how can we ensure that that is enabled and sustained in any further restrictions that we might have, as Lolu described, for children during holidays or indeed for older people living alone. So I think this is a journey and we really, really must stay on it.
Thank you. Dean?
Yes, typically Maddie has stolen sort of 50% of my points. But I think the critical important bit is not just about partnerships with the statutory community, but with the communities and with the voluntary sector. I think, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of time because coming out of the first lockdown and the first peak, we were at, between 40 to 60% of voluntary organizations and these community groups that we're going to rely on to deliver this, that were going to be at high risk. And now going into the second wave, where that risk is going to be sort of more acute. So there is, I think for the first sort of time, we have to deliver strategy at pace, and unfortunately, that will mean outreaching to community groups that we probably have not spoken to before, because it's all about stopping the wave where it's generated, as opposed to picking up the casualties where the waves are sort of crashing. So I think it's really critically important that we do quite a lot of outreach work, and that we don't restrict our conversations just with the statutory bodies, which we absolutely need. We do get into the voluntary organizations, because with the financial pressures that the UK as a system is going to go through, we are going to need a very cost-effective, very grassroots approach to this, to make this sustainable and scalable.
Thank you. Good points there. Lolu and Ed, are your hands still up for anything new? No. And the concept of socialising more to medicalise less, I think, still remains very valid. And this isn't about demedicalising people. This is just not about medicalising them in the first place. And the opportunity to do that with the resources that we are spending perhaps not in the best way, we have to take any opportunity we get to do this. I suppose the question really is about, maybe I'll pose this back to you, Maddie, is how do we stay focused on this and take it to the next level as a consequence of knowing what we know?
So I think it is by working in partnership both with our voluntary sector partners, community partners. I mean, you can see in the report the absolute diversity range of organisations that we partnered with, and that's a really good thing in terms of, you know, offering different sizes of grants, just being very open. So we need to, I think, sustain, and we have got mechanisms to do that, sustain those partnerships. I think the partnership with the statutory bodies is also really key. So with the organisations that are partners, that are part of the Collaborative Communities Board. So as soon as that work's brought to fruition, we'd like to bring it back, I think. And if the soonest opportunity is clinical exec, maybe we could take that one first, because I think as we go into winter, we really we need to take stock. We need to do this together. But as Dean said, we really don't need to wait too long, because we'll miss need in doing.
Thank you. So we'll look forward to that. Have we got even an idea as to timeframes on that?
I'm gonna have to phone a friend on this. So Louise is here. I don't know whether you can help me with that one, Louise.
The Collaborative Communities Board is meeting just currently, actually, Mark, and they're discussing it at that, alongside some other issues around hardship, financial hardship for residents of Ipswich and East Suffolk. So hopefully we'll have an answer later today. I'll chase that up for you.
Okay, so if we just pop it in the action log, and then if we can update with a proposed timetable, that would be great.
Perfect.
Thanks, Louise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for that. So I'm going to take us back to, or forward on to, item 11. And Jane, can we include item 16 in there, which seemed to sort of go hand in hand with part of the request for 11 anyway?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So apologies, there are quite a lot of financial type items. I will attempt to try and get through those as efficiently as we can. But just as I spoke about earlier, the regime that we've been dealing with up till the end of September, the regime that comes in from the 1st of October has been changing, and it continues to do so. So when I wrote the paper just over a week ago, we hadn't heard about what would happen from the 1st of October, hence needing to write the paper and to put something in place for us to continue and be legal as a CCG. What has happened since I wrote the paper was the middle of last week. We did receive notification of the way that finances would be working from 1st of October, and receive some indicative allocations for our system in Suffolk and North East Essex. So we are working through those allocations at the moment, and what I was just going to do is give you a quick overview of what that kind of looks like, the work that we've got underway, and come back to the recommendations, most of which for both papers still stand, but just in that slightly different context. So as I said, middle of last week, we heard about the new financial architecture that's coming into place from the 1st of October. I went through some of this previously with the Finance Committee, just about what we were expecting, and a lot of that has transpired. It is going to be more of a hybrid situation between the emergency arrangements we've had in for the first half of the year, where things like payments to our main providers are prescribed for us, but also a movement back to more of a business as usual situation, whereby the CCG will receive, by the system, the CCGs will receive allocations for the rest of the year, just as we normally would, and that central top-up associated with COVID will not continue from the 1st of October. Now, that obviously the proviso there is around any sort of second wave and how that impacts on things, but NHS Finance takes a little while to catch up, so we are at the moment still working in the expectation that we're into recovery and business as usual for the second part of the year. So we received our system allocation and that for the second half of the year, and we are looking at how that pans through. It does include an allocation to cover the excess costs associated with COVID. That's for ourselves as CCGs, for our services, but also for the providers that count within the Suffolk and North East Essex ring fence when it comes to control total. So that is ESNEF, West Suffolk Foundation Trust and the Ambulance Trust, because Ipswich and East, as the lead commissioner, looks after the finances for the Ambulance Trust on behalf of the region in this case. We don't include the finances for either mental health provider that falls within Suffolk and North East Essex, or for Ipswich and East, obviously that's an SFT, because they fall within their host area, which is Norfolk for this purpose. So what we do know is that there are a few changes in the architecture which I think I should bring to the board's attention. The first being that there are some areas which are outside of the new allocations and arrangements, and the most significant of those from the CCG's point of view is the hospital discharge programme, which will continue to be funded and managed centrally. So when I come on to later about arrangements about maintaining the resource committee, we will have some elements that are still on a kind of need to claim, approve and reimburse basis. I think that's good news for us. There's been a lot of awful lot of good work that's come out of the hospital discharge programme in terms of flow and movement around the system. Things will be changing or have changed from the 1st of September. However, there is additional funding to support that very early stage of either admission avoidance or hospital discharge for the first 6 weeks, and we're working closely with Suffolk County Council on how best to maintain some of the good work that we put in place during the COVID response within that additional funding. So that's watch this space. Hopefully we'll be able to talk more about that as that's been finalised. So as I say, we are, in terms of the other things that are slightly different, and there's a question from a member of the public that will pertain to this later. One of the things which is part of the financial architecture to encourage activity to get going again is that there will be a return to marginal payments. So people know before we were on a payment by results, a sort of an activity-based costing basis, which we moved away from a few years ago in our system. There will be a slight return to that, whereby activity levels agreed with trusts, if they exceed those, there will be marginal increases in the payments that they receive, and if they're significantly under those, there will be marginal reductions in the payments that they receive. We've yet to see a lot of detail exactly how that will work, but it's around about 20% for subsets of activity, which are the more planned elective side and outpatients. It won't be associated with emergency activity. So at the moment, we are working through those allocations and trying to understand exactly what they mean for the system. We undertook a piece of planning work for the beginning of the month, where we looked at what the costs were likely to be associated with the return to the activity levels, which are getting back to or 90% of those achieved last year. And so what we're doing at the moment is comparing the allocations that we've just been notified, trying to understand exactly how they flow through the system. They are quite complex, and comparing those with the likely costs. We anticipate that there will be a shortfall in those, but we'll be working with region and with our local providers to understand where the gaps are and what we can do to mitigate those where possible. So in terms of that financial planning work, I think we heard earlier on the agenda that we've submitted an awful lot of work around workforce, around activity plans, around a significant narrative around the phase 3 recovery that went into from the system yesterday. The financial templates associated with that, because the allocations have only just come out, have got another couple of weeks. So we will be submitting a system finance plan, a draft one at least, in early October. What will follow from that are detailed plans for each individual organisation, and I will be asking the Finance Committee to put in an additional meeting to review those, probably in mid to late October, once we've gone through the detail. And I think when I say go through the detail, I think what's happening, we've had quite a lot of guidance around this, a very detailed document, but just to reflect that there was a national webinar to try and explain the guidance and how it would work, and there were over 250 questions raised from the finance leaders across the NHS, which we need to kind of see how a lot of those work through. And particularly for us, as we're the host for the ambulance service, we need to understand exactly how that works so that we treat the ambulance trust fairly with respect to the rest of our system, and understand exactly how our allocations have been impacted by hosting that particular regional service. So that's probably all I wanted to say on the paper. So I thought it probably best if I run through the recommendations, Chair, and just kind of say which ones of those still apply. I'll do the ones on paper 11 first, and then I'll come on to the paper 16, or whichever is the subsequent one afterwards. So in terms of the recommendations in paper 11, the first one was to note the extension of the emergency finance period. That one's not relevant anymore. The emergency finance period will end on the 30th September, but we will be into the sort of hybrid second half of the year model, which we do need to do more work on. So the second recommendation is still valid, because until we've worked through those, and indeed once we have worked through, a lot of the arrangements that are currently in place in terms of budgets will need to continue. And so until we've finalised that and brought that back through the Finance Committee, we will need to continue with the budgets and arrangements that are still in place as a kind of backstop measure until we've got more information. I've asked you to note that work is underway on the financial plan for the second half of the year, and that's certainly the case. It's been slightly accelerated by the funding announcement, which is actually helpful, helps us to slot, at least we know one side of the equation, and so we can start to compare income with expenditure and try and understand that better. And then finally, because of the timing of the governing bodies, I'd just like to use us as a governing body to reconfirm that we're happy for the Finance Committee to pick up the reins on developing that financial plan. Obviously, we need to bring that back for proper public scrutiny and to report back to the governing body. But what I would like to do is to be progressing that work with the Finance Performance Committee in the meantime. So that's the end of paper 11, Mark. Shall I move straight on to the next one? I've got to find it in my papers, so I'll try and flick through very quickly. But the next paper really accompanies that. So it's the paper around the extension of the emergency financial arrangements, and we'll get there eventually. But effectively what the paper is, in anticipation of the emergency financial arrangements rolling forward, again, a paper that's slightly out of date, but actually still relevant. What I'm asking the governing body to do is to leave in place those measures that we put in to support the emergency financial arrangements. So effectively, it's two things. It was around the temporary changes to the delegated limits and the continuation of the committee that we established to support COVID, the COVID Resource Approval Committee, the CRAC Committee. Now, CRAC Committee has still got some work to do in terms of finishing off some of the review of the work that it's done. But also moving forward, with the hospital discharge programme remaining on a reimbursement basis, I do feel that actually having the resources committee, which can work across the three CCGs in place, will still be helpful. And obviously, we have the threat of second wave to deal with. I think it's a good idea for us to leave the committee in place. If we don't need it, we won't call it. So that is my suggestion around that. And we talked it through with the three chairs and Ed, who are on the resources committee, and they were all content with doing that. Although obviously what we're trying to do is to move back to business as usual and make decisions back through our normal CCG governance and our emerging alliances. So we need to kind of walk that line very carefully. But having the CRAC committee in place, I think, is a prudent thing to do for the next 2 months. We extended our financial limits as set out in the paper to match that. There haven't been many instances where we've gone above the financial limits that we'd previously approved, but particularly for hospital discharge programme through the CRAC committee, there have been some instances where we've used those higher limits. So again, I'm asking if we can continue those. We again won't use them unless we need to. But just to update the governing body that as we said when we brought the paper last time, the audit committee is undertaking a review of financial limits as part of the wider work on alliance governance, which is being worked across Ipswich and East. We hopefully had a good discussion. Graham may want to comment at the audit committee last week around maybe developing a slightly different way to try and get the balance right, where all clinical and relevant decisions do go through the clinical exec, but where it's more technical, so inflation levels or something like our audit tendering or something, we can deal with those as a management team to try to focus the clinical exec's time on the things that are where you can have the maximum input. So more to come on that, but that's the way that the audit committee is thinking about developing this, rather than using necessarily a financial limit, using more of a kind of flow chart around decision making, which will hopefully deal with both issues. Will help us to get things into the right place. So apologies for a rather long discussion on that, but basically the recommendations in this paper still stand. I'm asking for the governing body to roll forward the arrangements that we've got in place, noting that we will only use them where it's necessary to do so, and we'll review again when we meet again in November.
Thanks, Jane. Greg, did you want to make any comments at this point?
Yes, Mark. I was just trying to find the button to put my hand up. And going back to what Jane was saying about the audit committee reviewing the scheme of delegation, certainly one of the big concerns that we had, and I think Imran raised it probably about a year ago, was that if we did raise the limits and Ed and his senior team were able to make the decisions, would that completely bypass the clinical input? And I just want to say, we're completely aware of that. And that is one of the key themes going through how we look at the scheme of delegation going forward. So that should probably come back, I would say, Jane, probably at the next governing body meeting. Certainly no later, I wouldn't have thought. And just going back to your first paper, Jane, where you said you were expecting a shortfall from the allocation for the second half of the year. So you've obviously got an idea of, there is going to be a shortfall. Is that going to be manageable, like, around the 1 million mark, or is it, you think we're expecting like a 10 million shortfall?
So if we're talking about the CCGs, it's more like the former, the CCG shortfall, but we're obviously looking at this across the system. So it's too early for me to be giving a formal figure on this, but across the region and across our system, when we pull forward our estimates of income, our allocation, and our estimates of expenditure, there were significant gaps, particularly in some of the provider trusts. So, but until we've done that work, it's probably unfair of me to give you figures that will then prove to be wrong. But on the CCG side, it's going to be there's likely to be a shortfall, but relatively small.
Thanks, John.
Well, thank you as usual to both Graham and Jane for making something that's implicitly complicated and stressful fairly simple and reasonably easy to understand. And I suppose my difficulty in this is my assurance around this. I appreciate that we can't be assured as a governing body around the finances and the escalation and the challenges and the flexibility we have to show layers some serious challenges and issues. The bits that I can't quite see are around the delegation between CRAC and FPC and how that dynamic works to provide assurance for the governing body. I need to be assured, I suppose, that we have enough capacity and effective flexibility within and between those two groups in order to provide resilience. And for that to be visible and accountable at the end, and I'm sure you're working on that through providing that information through the outputs of those committees. And moreover, I think that the delegated lines of finance need to have that explicit link with clinical quality and escalation finance to make sure that the population goals are both effectively met and efficiently delivered. And I know that I'm asking an awful lot, but perhaps it's really the lines that I'm looking for. I'm looking for the clear lines of sight backwards from just the scrutiny that we would like at a governing body and through our scrutiny committees, which by their nature are a little bit nebulous in hindsight, but probably need to be slightly more explicit by the time our next governing body comes around, please.
So, Mark, shall I pick up on that? And thank you, John. I mean, that's firstly, it's really helpful to get that kind of view, because I'm so steeped in this. Sometimes it's difficult to kind of pull back and think about it. So there's quite a lot in what you said there, and I apologize if I don't cover all of it, but particularly to start with the relationship between the governing body, the FPC, and the CRAC committee. So you'll see in terms of governing body, we've got the minutes of the CRAC committee that are reported to the governing body to give you oversight of all the decisions that are made. What we've actually put in terms of the terms of reference when we set up the CRAC committee was that the Finance Committee would provide the assurance on behalf of the board. And the way that we've done that is that the Finance Committee receives a full report of all the decisions broken down by CCG. So effectively, it's taking all those minutes and it's putting it into a nice table where you can see exactly what was agreed on which date and amounts. And we had the Finance Committee last week, and at the request of the previous Finance Committee, we had actually broken it down into the individual amounts per CCG, and I've done a full analysis back from the beginning of the year on that. So so you will see when the Finance Committee minutes come through how that's reported. But so I can give you some assurance, and we've obviously got members of the Finance Committee on the call who can speak about that. So we are doing that, and the committee is made up of the chairs of the 3 CCGs, is made up of Ed and myself, and a lot of the other CCG directors obviously come along to present particular papers. So I do think we've got a good link between the two. Indeed, we asked internal audit to look at the arrangements for the CRAC committee, and didn't quite make it to audit committee because it only appeared this week, but I've had a letter back from RSM, our internal auditors, saying that they are satisfied with the arrangements, and I will share that with audit committee chairs over the next few days, which that's really reassuring from my point of view. I found that really helpful. Finally, and it's something that I meant to mention earlier, so thank you, John, for reminding me that I need to talk about it. Each organisation within the patch and nationally is going to be part of a rolling audit programme. So Deloitte have been commissioned to look at the COVID expenditure of each organisation, and Ipswich and East is in the next round. Ipswich and East Suffolk CCG is in the next round. So we've had some initial meetings with Deloitte, who are going to be looking at the month 1 and month 2 COVID claims that we've made as a CCG. So that again, we spoke about that at audit committee last week, and that again will give us some further reassurance. Difficult to know why we've been chosen, but because we are the host for the hospital discharge programme for Suffolk, the Ipswich and East claims are relatively high. So we could well have been chosen for that reason, but I actually find it useful to get early insight on this, as we still got a little bit of the process still to go through. They're also looking at Cambridge University hospitals during this round, so we'll be a little bit of a small fish compared with that, I think. But we made good progress on the audit so far, and we've got a hold harmless letter which allows us to see the results, even though it's a national / regional audit. So we'll be able to actually action any recommendations that come through as part of that. John, I'm not sure I answered everything there, but I'm quite happy to pick up offline if there are further bits.
Okay, thank you. Ed?
Just on the committee itself, I mean, if John or any other colleagues wanted to join a CRAC meeting to see how it works and just feel assured that it's working in the right spirit, please feel free to do so. In my experience, it's difficult to get a word in edgeways from Mark, Hassan and Christopher, so it is more than clinically led at times. But if anyone wants to join and enjoy the delights of the meeting, just let me or Jane know.
Yeah, and they, as Jane has said, you've got the CRAC committee making those COVID decisions, and then you've got FPC overseeing the strategic and performance scrutiny to give the assurance back up through to the governing body as a consequence of closing the loop around that. Good to hear that internal audit have given a positive statement, and this external audit on our processes that have come through from Deloitte will give us another opportunity to test the system that we put in place to manage the speed of decision making that's been required as a consequence of the pandemic demand. So any other points that anybody wishes to raise? So there was a series of notings and a couple of agreements there that the governing body are asked to agree. Is anybody not happy with any of those? I don't see any hands up, so I think we're going ahead with all of that, Jane. Thank you. So move on to item 12, governing body assurance framework. Graham, I don't think we've talked about everything within the framework today, but anything particular that you wanted to bring out?
No, I don't think so, Mark. As you know, it is a working document that's reviewed regularly. I mean, the only things that we didn't talk about today was, and they're not made, but it was GP capacity, cybersecurity, and workforce, and a level 4 national emergency. But everything else on the GBAF had been covered. So I don't know if any of the risk owners wanted to talk about the 4 things we didn't touch on, but I think everyone's fully up to date with those and know the direction we're heading with each risk. So I don't know if Amanda, you wanted to say anything in addition?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Graham. So in terms of cybersecurity risk, we know that that's been on our GBAF for several months now and continues to be actively managed by the IT team. And we have regular reports provided to our joint IT board. Now, with regards to the cybersecurity risk, we periodically have deep dive sessions with our audit committee. And in fact, last week we did actually do a deep dive to our audit committee, which was, I think, well received. And we've given them the necessary assurances that we continue to do all things within our gift to mitigate any future cyber attack on our system. So that's all I really wanted to raise regarding the cyber. In terms of the workforce, clearly that is an ongoing risk that continues to be mitigated by the alliances and through Lisa Llewellyn and the work that she's undertaking with her team working across the system. But I think through the training hub work as well, we're doing everything that we need to be doing to ensure that we have the appropriate workforce in the appropriate setting and the like. So they were probably the only 2 additions, Graham, that I would wish to add to the GBAF as it stands today. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. And I mean, the cybersecurity issue was a key one raised at the start of the pandemic because of the acceleration of the amount of remote working, the need for mobile IT equipment, and the accelerated use of different communication apps within that, the way that primary care were linking to patients, etc., wasn't there? Is anybody aware of any issues that have been associated with any of that risk? I mean, I'm not myself, but...
No, we haven't, although we do have regular and timely intelligence from our IT provider, NEL, and I think they do exceptional great work for us in doing what they call patching across the system to further prevent and mitigate. So I think between the IT team and NEL, we're doing absolutely everything we possibly can to protect our current systems as they stand at the moment.
Thank you. And the primary care network clinical directors are starting to look at how the workforce, particularly the new workforce in primary care through the additional roles that's coming in, how they get supported in terms of their training as that comes online. So I'm sure we'll be able to bring that back at some point. But a positive challenge that's coming into the system as new workforce comes on board. John?
Yeah, I think it's just important to notify that the risks aren't directly as a result of the technology, that it's directly as a result of the users and the way that it's implemented. And so I don't think we've had time enough to see that actually distill into significant volumes of actual risk reported by the clinical workforce or through information governance failures. So we have to be really cautious. I think our risk level has gone up, but our reporting has not followed that at this point in time. So we just need to be a wee bit careful and perhaps encourage our colleagues to report even near misses and learning events in order to ensure that we stay on track and don't cause ourselves more trouble than we need.
Thank you. Lisa, did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to, we haven't got a risk on our GBAF about health inequalities, and I don't know whether we should do, but we've spent a lot of time talking about health inequalities. Obviously, I work on the LD programme, which is another area of health inequalities. It felt wrong that we spend a lot of time talking about it, but it's not captured on our GBAF.
So would that be worth you having a little look in your departmental risk register, Lisa, to see where that's flagging, and just see whether the scoring reflects that concern, because it would then come through the risk committee, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't think, and I mean, Amanda may be able to tell me differently, but I don't think on any of our departmental risk registers we have a risk relating to health inequalities in Ipswich and East Suffolk. We may have one specific one relating to learning disabilities specifically around a performance target, but I don't think we have any the bigger system issue around health inequalities.
We don't, Lisa, and I think we need to, and I'm happy to take that as an action and take it back through the risk forum, and we can discuss it with the appropriate risk leads. And it may well be that we need to, as Mark has suggested, put it onto a departmental risk register, which might be the quality one, Lisa. But let's take that as an action, and we can follow that through for sure.
Mark, and can I just add there, I think that would be such a good idea, because it gets reviewed by 3 separate committees at more or less every month, and that way we'll always keep the BAM sort of community on everyone's focus. I think that's a really good suggestion, Lisa. Well done for raising it.
Thank you. And Ed, did you have an old hand there, or is that new?
No, it's very new. So it's youthful. So my question is about the update you gave, Lisa, around East and safeguarding and the issues there, whether that should be on our GBAF. And then secondly, for Amanda, I mean, this is a dog that isn't yet barking, but it will do soon, is around Brexit or EU exit, and whether we need to start looking at bringing that back onto the risk register, given what will happen in the next few months.
Absolutely, Ed. And on the Brexit risk, we know it was on our GBAF several months ago, then went on to the corporate directorate risk register. We actually had that exact conversation, Ed, at Audit Committee last week, and it was agreed that we would, at the next iteration of reviewing the register, bring that risk back. So when we come together, either at scrutiny or at the governing body, we will see the EU withdrawal back on the GBAF.
Thanks. So a few things for exploration in the next couple of months. Thank you very much. Shall we move into governance and corporate business? We've got a Financial Performance Committee annual report to receive. Note, Jane.
Yes, thank you. I'm taking this item on behalf of Steve Chicken, who's the chair, who would normally give it. This is the annual report prepared by the Finance Committee, reviewed at our meeting last week. It really just sets out the work that we did in the year up to the 31st of March. And I'll take it that people have read it, and just happy to take any questions.
Any questions? I think it's a developing committee, really. I think it's we have the question pretty much at the end of the every meeting, and what else should we do? What are we picking up here? So I think it's been quite a helpful one, having personally been quite sceptical at the start. So happy to take any questions. Graham?
Yeah, I was going to, because I actually chaired that last month, didn't I, for Steve in his absence. And at the end of it, when I was reflecting on it, I thought this is one of those committees where, because we're so well managed, in terms of our finance and where we're going and what the issues are going forward, you almost come away thinking, well, we sat around there for an hour, hour and a half, chatted, and then came away. It's more of an information giving thing. But certainly, if we were in a massive, great deficit, that committee would be so key going forward. And that's what I think. I know it's only meeting quarterly, which is probably enough now. But if there was a situation that Jane was talking about earlier, there is going to be a shortfall, that committee will come into its own at that time then. It might even get down to we need to meet fortnightly or something, as ridiculous as that. But yes, one of those funny committees, isn't it? While everything's running well, it seems like it's actually doing nothing other than providing oversight on the crack committee and things like that. But yeah, I think it will come into its own at some point. Hopefully not, but it might do.
But as you say, the opportunity is to do more preventative work. Yeah. As a consequence, not to have to do remedial stuff.
Yeah.
So looking at how the finance moves to alliance-based finance, that's the track that we're on. As we move to requiring end-to-end PMO site, it becomes very evident as we move within the Financial Performance Committee to being CCG focused to system focused, that we need to push the button on getting those other processes in place. And I think the consequence is that you then start developing more preventative measures. And any other questions? So happy to receive and note that annual report. Thank you, Jane. And then the Jane Paling Show continues with the formation of the auditor panel.
Yes, apologies, and I wish they were all a bit more exciting, but the next paper is just a statutory thing that we need to do. We, as I've discussed earlier, we do have two lots of audits for the CCGs. We have our internal auditors, which is a joint contract across our three CCGs. Our external audit contracts are coming to an end, and we've taken the opportunity to try to align across the three CCGs to go out to tender for a new external auditor to start from next year's accounts. So as part of that, the governing body does have to elect formally an auditor panel, and the paper is just a technical exercise around that. So terms of reference, which is a standard one taken from the HFMA national guidance on auditor panels. But as you'll see in the paper, what we are effectively doing is putting forward a panel made up from the audit committee, Graham as chair, myself and Steve Chicken. We know that Steve may not be able to attend, but we will try to do this remotely if possible. But we only need two of us to be actually physically present at the committee for it to work. So hopefully this is pragmatic. We will be doing this in conjunction with West Suffolk CCG and North East Essex CCG, so we will have plenty of representation across the CCG. So that's all really on that one. It's a bit of a formal process.
Okay. Does anyone have any queries about that or objections to it? That's fine. So we're happy to receive and approve that. Thank you. And then on to item 15, Graham and Jane, about the audit committee, the annual report in terms of reference.
So Graham, did you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, I'll take it. The excitement is just building, isn't it, with all this process stuff? But I don't plan to go through the report at all. It should be self-explanatory. The main purpose really is just to assure the governing body that the audit committee sort of complied with its terms of reference. And it has very specific duties and responsibilities, and they're actually listed in sections 1 and 2. Again, I won't go through that, but the rest of the paper then explains how those duties and responsibilities were met. We are a statutory committee. It's well established and runs very well. We have an annual review plan, an annual work plan, and we review the committee's performance at the end of each meeting. I guess I'll just leave it at that for now and take any questions. There's not really much to say. I mean, it only comes here because the audit handbook recommends that we present it to this meeting, but we probably need to rethink how we present all this sort of process paperwork to the governing body going forward, probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's right and proper, Graham, as an organisation taking our responsibilities for for financial prudence and good decision making.
Yes.
I think it's right and proper for that assurance.
Yeah.
Jane?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks both. Just to say huge thanks to Joe Mail, who pulled the report together, who administers that committee as well as many others. So that's why it's such a good report rather than one that I've pulled together. But secondly, just as we did earlier with the CRAC committee, if people would like to attend audit committee at any point, it's obviously an awful lot easier now. We're doing it over Teams, so please do get in touch if it's something that you would be interested in observing or attending.
Thank you.
No hands up there, Jack.
He's going to. So Ed, make sure it goes on her, the annual thing that we need to do to improve our performance. Shall we move on to item 17 then? Thank you.
Mark,
yeah.
You just need to approve the terms of reference.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Terms of reference, Graham.
I think Jane better do that, because basically it's delegating authority to the audit committee, which I chair. So it's probably not best for me to recommend that, Mark, if Jane could do that.
So again, very, very quickly, we are taking the opportunity when either the North East Essex or either of the Suffolk CCG terms of reference or policies come up for approval to try and align across the three. And so this is, I can't remember which one came up first. I think it might be North East Essex Audit Committee terms of reference. We've looked at, Emily, our governance accountant, has looked at both of the existing documents for both the Suffolk CCGs and North East Essex and the best practice in the HFMA handbook, and has come up with the terms of reference. Just commend it for governing body to approve.
Yeah, thank you for that. So again, with that, does anyone not content? In which case we're happy to approve. Thank you. And now we'll go on to item 17 and the Area Prescribing Committee. Maddie.
Thank you. So this is a new annual report, and in fact you might be quite surprised to have it as an annual report, given that you approved formally its terms of reference at the last governing body. But that's because they've been working in shadow form for a good 10 to 12 months. It's not a statutory committee, it's a recommendation of NHS England to have an area-based approach to prescribing. I think thanks to Anisha Sharma, who has not only kind of led the management of this committee, but has brought forward an excellent report. As everyone will remember, the purpose of the committee is to provide consistent evidence-based advice, not only to the CCGs, but to the hospitals, to primary care and to non-medical prescribers. and it has, over the last period, established those functions. It's a huge group. That's not an easy thing to do. It's a diverse community. So it's established those functions. They've worked collaboratively on guidelines and the entry of new medicines. And I want to particularly bring out the work that they're doing on shared care agreements. I don't think there's anyone from the clinical teams that would disagree that that's a really important focus and work that we can do to review and update and to set in place really effective ways to do that is critical. And I also just want to put out the work that's been done on appliances by this group. So previously a really neglected potentially area of our understanding and of our practice. We've had 2 excellent nurses in Suffolk working with a nurse colleague in North East Essex to really look very holistically at our formularies and at our approach to ensure that we're really giving the safest, highest quality and cost effective care through appliance prescribing. So I just want to mention that. And thirdly, as was highlighted at the last meeting, I think this group came into their own as they looked at the challenges presented by COVID, and particularly at bringing forward an end-of-life formulary for patients. And they really worked very hard together as a collective, not only with that group, but with the hospice as well, to achieve that. So there are 3 really important elements of this report, and on page 4 they set out the priorities for 2021, which fundamentally I think are to advance that agenda and to mature those relationships. We still have one really important piece of business to do for this committee, which will come out through our overall governance review, which is to consider its scheme of delegation. But as we do that, I hope that this report will give you confidence in the membership and what they can and will deliver together. Very happy to take any non-technical questions.
Thank you, Maddie. And a sort of an excellent example of how collaborative work across the 3 CCGs can, particularly in areas where there is absolutely shared commonality, can just make a big difference in doing things once rather than 3 times.
Absolutely.
Any questions that anyone wanted to ask or observations they wanted to give? So thank you. Thanks, Maddie, and thanks to the team for the report, and look forward to seeing the additional work that they'll get through as a consequence of having established that relationship and working arrangement. Shall we move into item 18, Graham? We've got all of the minutes of the various meetings that we've had. Has there been anything that needs drawing to our attention particularly? No.
I didn't have anything like that.
Did anyone have any questions over any of those items? No, in which case we'll move on to the date and time of the next governing body, Tuesday the 24th of November, very likely to be in the same format. I can't see us going back into a room anywhere just yet, in which case we've got time for questions from the public. Simon, you've been taking questions as they've come in, and we've also had a question that was given to us prior to the meeting starting. So do you want to fire away and we'll see where we get to?
Sure, yes. So the first set of questions we've had since the start of the meeting have come from a Mr. Anthony Dooley. The first question that he's put to us is: a recent poll found that 74% of those asked said they would favour the ending of the outsourcing of the current failing test and trace system, he says, to be replaced by a genuine NHS and local public health-led system. Do you support that majority view?
Okay. We don't know who was asked in that poll, do we?
There's no details here. No, that's the question from Mr. Dooley.
Ooh, who would like to start on? We haven't got anyone from public health here today. I mean, essentially we have to work with what we have to work with, and those who've put in place those decisions have got to decide whether that is the best way forward, and depending on the outcome of that, we have to either take control of what we are able to do locally and build on what there is there, or I don't see any other way around it. Ed?
Yeah, I agree with that, Mark. I think that question is one for the Department of Health and Social Care to answer. But I think, as we described earlier in the meeting, the Pillar 1 arrangements in our local system, where the NHS is in control, I think we're doing a pretty good job. So I think we're making good progress there. But the Pillar 2 is organised nationally through the government, so that's where that question should be answered.
Thank you.
Next one.
So the second question from Mr. Dooley is as follows. Could you remind me, please, of the 3-word term to describe how the deficits standing in trusts are to be reconfigured, since the announcement a while ago that these deficits were to be written off was not exactly true? Mr. Dooley also goes on to say, also I note from a recent edition of the HSJ that there is to be a change in how finance is to be allocated based on system-level performances as opposed to individual organisations. How is that meant to work? He goes on to say, also, I understand that systems will be expected to reach at least 90% of the 2019 to 2020 targets for overnight electives and outpatient day case procedures by October. If systems fall short of the 90% target, then baseline income will be reduced by 75%. As a trust finance director in the Midlands is quoted as saying, quote, 90% is likely to be ambitious, which brings in disincentives, because if you are going to fail, in brackets, to meet the target, close brackets, you might as well fail by a lot. That's from a business perspective as opposed to a patient care perspective, close quote. However, there is apparently a letter from the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Operating Officer that states, quote, we expect all organisations to work together to ensure resources are used to deliver maximum benefit for patients and the taxpayer. So Mr. Dooley asks, I wonder what the view of the CCG is regarding these statements and expectations.
So I think much of that was covered in Jane's paper in paper 11. I think I would expect the Chief Operating Officer and the Chief Finance Officer of the NHS to back the demand that they've made rather than undermine it. Jane, did you have anything else to add to that particular question?
So thank you, Mark. I'll try to be brief. So there's a question about two different things. The first one is about the announcement that was made, I think, February time, around trust debt write-off. So the particular question asked for the 3-letter acronym. So I'll try to explain this. So historically, trusts, so CCGs have not been able to have loans in those that we're talking about. So we really are talking about trust finance. So for example, ESNEFT has in the past had drawn down loans to support capital expenditure, and or some trusts have had loans to support their working capital, their day-to-day expenditure. If they're in a deficit position, they have had to historically have loans to support payment of wages, etc. So in around about February time, it was announced, but it had been planned for a while, to convert those loans into something called public dividend capital, PDC. That's the 3-letter acronym that Mr. Dooley refers to. So at the time, I did send around some information, including to Mr. Dooley, that was included in the HSJ about how this would work. It is a positive move for trusts, but it doesn't effectively wipe out those loans. It converts them into more of an equity basis. So whilst they don't have to repay the capital, they do have to pay a PDC, a public dividend capital dividend, each year. So it is part of restructuring the NHS finances overall. Trust colleagues tell me it is a positive move, but it's not the nirvana that it was potentially thought to be. So I'll leave that one there, if that's okay, Chair. And then the second one, I think you're right. I did try to cover this in my paper in anticipation of the question. So effectively, this was talking about the move towards incentivising the system to undertake additional activity, or at least to get up to its 90% by putting in place these marginal payments. So there seems to be a little bit of a confusion on percentages in there, but as far as I understand it, and it's all subject to final clarification, it concentrates on elective activity and outpatients, as I spoke about, and the marginal either reduction or increase is 20% on the activity not done. So if you do 91% of activity, you're 1% over the target, you would get a 20% increased payment on that 1%. So I'm struggling to know where those really big figures that were quoted in there were talking about, and why that would lead to an incentive to do significantly lower activity, because it is supposed to be related to the actual activity that you undertake. So if you miss by a little bit, then the fine's very small. If you miss by a large amount, the fine's very large. I need to read the HSJ article, which I haven't seen, to see the real detail of it, but that's what I understand. That's how I understand it will work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The third question then for Mr. Dooley. Would the CCG like to respond to the suggestion from Dido Harding that the proposed future moonshot COVID-19 tests will not be available on the NHS other than for those with symptoms? This means that those who can afford it can buy a test, but for those who can't afford it, including those in poverty, won't be able to do so.
So, anyone for comments on that? I mean, I've not particularly seen that quotation, but just on the principle, testing being for those with symptoms. Lisa.
So I'm not aware of the second part of Mr. Dooley's question, but around purchasing tests, but certainly there has been some communication and a drive to make sure that the tests are reserved for people that are symptomatic. It's really important that the testing is done during a specific couple of days within the actual illness development. If it's done outside of that, you'll get a false result. And I think what's been seen nationally is, particularly as schools have returned, are people using the testing service with obviously the best kind of endeavours in mind. They genuinely want to find out if they know they've been in contact with somebody, if they've developed the illness, but are not at that point symptomatic. And the national ask is for the testing process to only be used by people that are symptomatic. But I haven't heard anything in relation to a tiered system about people buying tests.
I suppose the moonshot was looking at testing people from almost a screening perspective, as opposed to managing those with suspected symptoms and the disease itself. So I think that was part of the intention of the moonshot project, 10 million tests a day or whatever. So I think having a focus that's particularly on the symptomatic is really important, given the fact that you've got we still have to manage a quite significant false negative rate, and the impact of that, which can't get us out of having to apply good infection prevention and control measures. It's not an excuse. You can't get away from that. The impact of doing the big screening is that the false positives come into the equation, and I think it's about a 1% false positive. So that means you get a positive test when you're not positive. And if you've got a positive test and no symptoms, then you're really hamstrung. And again, you will potentially end up, if you're doing major screening, with large populations having to self-isolate who don't actually have a disease. And therefore that will impact on productivity and everything else. So, I think there are two different things that are being talked about here, and a potential risk of being confused as a consequence. And I think the priority is on managing people who've got symptoms.
Thank you. Just one last question now from a Mr. Roger Allam. And he asks, why does the CCG contest appeals from doctors? My question is a procedural one. If a doctor appeals, he or she does not do it for fun. There's a reason to investigate further, not just shut the process down.
And I think we're assuming that this is in relation to IFR. Lisa?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I suspect it is related to our individual funding request process, and obviously if there is an appeal from a GP, that is considered by a panel, not a person. But I think it might be wiser for this question if the member of public contacts me with details of this particular case, and we can either relook at the process and look at the appeal decision and maybe explain that in a bit more detail, and also go through the IFR process if that would be helpful. I'm very happy to do that. Shall I put my contact details with Simon? Is the best way to put my contact details in the chat box, or how?
I will respond to Mr. Allen with your details, Lisa, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And anything else, Simon?
No, those are all the questions. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for your attention, board. Thank you for your attention and for joining us. If you're out there in the public listening in, if you are out there, can you please give us any constructive feedback through to Simon about the experience you've had today of the meeting and what we can do to improve that for you. Look forward to hearing from you in that regard. So we'll meet again on Tuesday the 24th of November between 9 and 1. We'll probably be doing exactly the same arrangements. For the rest of the governing body, if you can leave this meeting and then come into our part 2, which will be starting in 5 minutes. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.